Chapter 4, 151, Chapter 70, Consolidating the City. Raven's point of view. The army quartermaster shuffled on her feet as I rapidly skimmed through the stack of parchment she brought me, momentarily reminding me of her presence. "You may take a seat while you wait," I say without looking up. She walks away a moment later, and I barely catch a relieved sigh. "What are we looking at?" Demnavani questions lazily. "Much of what you'd expect, really," I drawl and lean into my throne. The repurposed throne room of Almalexia carrying my voice a bit more ably than one might expect. Ruined or dried-out wells, unmaintained roads not critical for the Argonians, numerous food stores raided either by the lizards themselves or some of the less honest Dunmer. What else did you expect of the beasts? He scoffs, generously forgetting about the part where our fellow elves did a part of the damage. I hold back an eye roll and give him a meaningful look. My expectations do not remove the need to fix the situation, as you are very much aware. His annoyed expression remains for all of 1 second before he realizes what I was getting at. "You aren't asking me to tell my subjects to dig wells, are you?" The way he said it, I may as well have just asked them to shovel shit. "Well, they can either speed up critical infrastructure repairs," I smirk, "or they can lead the next charge themselves, since the rest of us will be too busy to help them." He tisks and looks away. "Besides," now I do roll my eyes, "the automatons will be there to help them. I just need some earth moved rapidly, and as much as I'd like to do it myself, I do have work to do." "No, Balladas raises a hand. "I will get them to do it. There is no need to humiliate them like that." "How nice of you to see my point." I smile beatifically. He looks like he really wants to flip me off. "Alandro," I turn to the other great lord present. "How is public order looking?" "Excepting a few greedy fools," he scowls. "Our fellow Dunmer are happy to be liberated and are cooperative for the most part, even offering meager gifts and places to rest for the soldiers." I say nothing but do raise an eyebrow at the offer of housing. That kind of discipline and readiness risk is not permissible outside of official leave. It was all a bit hypocritical since we were currently occupying a number of buildings to house the troops keeping order in the city, but such semantics were sometimes necessary. "They were denied, obviously," he confirms. Almiral Farron, representing the Redaran until Sarano arrived a day hence, nodded. "Good." Alandro smiles thinly before continuing. "As for the violence, I have managed to keep it mostly contained." He hesitates for a moment, holding back a visible gulp. A few altercations were still inevitable, however, and there were a number of deaths. "Any by the soldiers?" I ask immediately. One group came close. His eyes darken. "They have been taught a lesson." "Good." I smile at him approvingly. "Good?" He blinks. "My lord, did you not tell me?" He trails off. "You cannot be everywhere at all times." I wave his concerns off. "You were tasked with keeping order and discipline in the army. Continue to do so, and your task will be considered accomplished." "Oh, of course." He inclines his head, his shoulders slumping with relief. This drew some eyes, but none were quite so over-curious as to actually ask. Nodding in satisfaction, I turn to the next item. "Sadras, how are the city's supplies looking?" "Surprisingly good, all things considered." Regnild answers from a lower seat. "The Argonians stocked large amounts of food for their army, and most of it was kept within the city. There was some damage from pillaging, but there is still more than enough food until trade lanes are re-established." He pauses and adds, "Will probably taste terrible, but it is perfectly edible." "Have someone check on that just in case," I order. He writes it down without bothering to question it. "Very well. As for the building supplies and other non-immediately essential resources, the situation is much poorer. Critical repairs will be manageable, but any greater projects will have to wait for imports." Imports that just happen to be most accessible by House Sadras, shipping down the river to Mournhold's north, of course. I keep my expression blank and merely give him a long look. His lip twitches upwards and he inclines his head. "My house will be more than willing to provide the best rates reasonable." I make a vaguely agreeable noise. "Very well." Renglind looks very satisfied as he closes his ledger. "Will that be all?" I ask as everyone turns silent. There is some muttering, but after a while they fail to bring anything up. Excellent, I tap the table. With that, you may all return to your duties. Taking the dismissal for what it was, soon the room is left empty, save for one. My eyes meet those of Davos, his form completely unmoving in a dark corner of the room, as it was for the entire 2-hour-long meeting. You indicated you found something new. 3 somethings, actually, he corrects. Stalked your hammer-wielding friend for a while and saw him entering a shop like he owned the place. Don't know what exactly he was doing, but might be wise to question him on it. I think not, I say after a short hum. He grew up in this place and he is allowed his secrets. Nerevar could have made my job much, much harder if he wanted to. He did not. Me not bothering him needlessly was perfectly reasonable. Whatever you say, boss. He shrugs and continues where he left off. Anandor took over a small tower to the east of the inner city. He set up a small shrine to Oriel and is spending most of his time there. The other Falmer are also visiting. That could prove troublesome, still they have the right and Anandor needs the peace of mind. I frown, tell them to keep it discreet. They've earned a lot of respect for the army, but an ounce of prevention and all that. Will do. He nods. As for the third thing, well, we managed to find a Kamona Tong hideout below a large manor in the outer city, and I am unsure how to proceed. Did you establish contact, at least? I ask, intrigued by the presence of the usually very isolationist thieves' guild. Scratch that. They were extreme enough to trade with Dagoth at one point, so I will not be holding my breath on their usefulness. Only observation. He answers, they don't seem terribly well organized from what we've seen, and were serving more as a smuggling operation for the occupied populace than any kind of power block in their own right. Could also be just a bunch of edgy kids deciding to recreate a notorious guild. So simply getting rid of them might annoy some of the more influential locals. I frown. Why not just talk to them and have them work for us? Davos asks. Sure, having them here may be annoying, but so long as they don't create chaos, they shouldn't really be a problem. That would be the most expedient solution, I mutter, but we would have to take into account how the last iteration of their guild viewed outsiders and cooperation with them. I pause. Speaking of that, has there been any issues with Furious's cohort? Davos blinks and shakes his head. None that I've heard of. Mournhold is a big place, and there is still a number of humans living here, so they are at least used to the idea of them. Small mercies, I suppose. I sigh. You can't really fight beside someone and hate their guts just because they are different, boss. Davos shrugs. Well, unless you are a cunt, but there ain't no helping those idiots. We share a short chuckle at that. So what do you want me to do with them? He brings us back. Contact them for now, I suppose. I restrain my urge to just whack anyone too annoying. They were useful for the populace, and having their voices added to ours would be a boon. Maybe propose a restructuring into an actual merchant company. That would make them much less annoying to deal with. Boss, Davos winces. You do realize they would still keep doing what they were doing already, right? Well, obviously, I roll my eyes. I'd just be able to seize all their legal assets in an instant if they annoyed me. Carrot and stick, Davos, carrot and stick. Davos smirks after a moment. That kind of bait is too juicy not to bite on. That much is for certain. He pauses and asks, won't this annoy the Sadra's interests, though? They were looking forward to setting up in Mournhold. I am already giving them a massive boon with the Skyrim trade deals and Regnild's most recent scheme. There is no way in Oblivion I am about to give exclusive access to my future capital's economy to any one organization, I scoff. That is just asking for issues to crop up later. Capital, boss? He frowns. At least politically, I shrug. What better way to reunite a people than reconquering an ancient seat and making it the center of it all once again? And that is without mentioning its strategic and economic position. I guess that makes sense, he mutters after a while. I'm just afraid you will keep moving us around, especially after we've finally settled into Silrune Fell properly. Oh, don't worry about that. I wave him off. I am too used to the cold to spend too much time here. It is an issue I will have to solve later, but one that I will solve no matter what. The frown leaves him, and he grins. Sure thing, boss. Happy you won't have to tell the wife you are moving, I ask with a cheeky grin. He shudders. Don't wish that kind of evil on me. With a snort, I wave for him to get to work. Go on then. I'm sure Nightshade won't appreciate it if you failed to get the kimono under us. He goes to leave halfway through my sentence and then stills utterly before slowly turning his gaze to me. You are one evil, evil mer boss. I just smile. He chuckles and takes his leave. Now then. I mutter to myself as I teleport to my temporary chamber. It was high time I finally cracked you open. Before me now stood a standing table and a dark violet cover book, the very same I got as a reward for fixing Morrowind. My Hortator, the sworn mer guarding my door, looks at me with concern. Are you well? Holding back a grumble, I wave him off. Just a minor headache. Think nothing of it. I see him frown behind his masked helm, but he steps back. By your will. Minor headache, my grey ass. That book was evil. Nay, it was beyond evil. The chucklefuck that gave me the system must have found it incredibly funny to dangle the exact information I craved the most before me and make it as unreasonably complicated as inhumanly possible. Fucker didn't even bother sending a fully translated version over, which meant I had to decipher the damn thing first before even attempting to make use of the concepts held within. And that is without adding the fact the magic itself used runes even more alien than Magnus. Bah, I shouldn't be complaining. The simple fact I was given anything was already more than excellent, and a bit of effort to reach my goals was what made reaching them worthwhile to begin with. There was probably some hidden lesson in there as well that I was too whiny to consider right now. I already took far too many things for granted, anything from magic to my bloodline to the impression I made on people that made them more interested and agreeable. Not being able to unlock the highest concepts of space magic after one read should be the expected result, and that was that. Slightly less frustrated, I let out a long exhale and feel the stress of the night leave me. What time is it? I ask the guards who began following me. Just after noon, Hortator. The same one from earlier responds, Scouts have reported sightings of Lord Sarano's army in the distance. They should arrive in some 3 hours. I pause and turn to him, and why was I not informed of this? He looks away. We knocked on your door, but you would not answer, and Lord Davos told us you wouldn't mind it. Fair enough. I keep walking. He was correct. I do not need to micromanage everything. The guards visibly relax. Come on then. I wave for them to follow. I have yet to visit the temple. All three of the good Daedra were practically beaming at the idea of me ransacking the place, but when I directed a thought of repurposing it, their way they turned even more excited. Bunch of hyper-powered high school girls, I swear. General POV. We should leave. Her second-in-command said for the 50th time that day, even if they haven't noticed us yet, they will, and you know how annoyed the high and mighty types get with people like us. Varana held back a sigh. What people like us, Freydear? We are but pious helpers of the oppressed people they have come to liberate. The stocky elf scoffs. You may call yourself Kingpin, Varana, but we both know we have nowhere near the influence we once did. She hums irritatingly, and any large movements might do exactly what you were afraid of happening. Fradir clutches at his hair and grunts angrily. Damn it, woman, they have the woodsman with them. If we don't get out, we are fucked. She just smiles at him. Relax, panicking will do us no good, and we have too many to move anyway. The stocky elf grumbles, but reluctantly agrees. Fine, I can accept that. But what do we actually do about it? Varana massages her forehead. We lay low and attempt to seamlessly integrate over time. It will be a hit on our profits, but our only other options are running or meeting with the authorities. Fradir huffs, finding the mere idea of the latter incredibly funny. Their underground base is a whirl of activity as they exit their secluded meeting spot, dozens of eyes falling on them immediately, all of them apprehensive about the massive shift in circumstance and their possible futures. But before Varana could so much as speak up, the light around them all shifted, and they found themselves surrounded with dozens of figures, all armed and armored for battle to differing degrees. The kingpin of the reformed Kamona Tong kept her panic down as she began counting their attackers, but with each passing moment The realization of just how outmatched she was began to settle. So she tried the diplomatic approach, greetings friends. She went to speak further, but one of the armored figures in a white fur cloak pointed a rather dangerous-looking crossbow at her, causing her to wince and slowly raise her hands, the rest of her business partners hesitantly doing much the same. Still unwilling to just roll over, she spoke, "Are we being arrested for something?" The only ambusher currently not showing any hostility, much the opposite really, as he lounged in her own chair at the high table, chuckled, "Nothing just yet." He straightened in his seat and clapped his hands. Consider this a bit of a meet and greet, as it were. Her eyes still kept scanning the area as he spoke, and she almost regretted it, as in one of the corners of the room she saw a fully covered elf wearing the distinct markings of the Morag tongue. Our little family is of course more than willing to discuss cooperating with the honored Hortator's men. She smiled at the seated elf as she shifted gears. However, would it not be more expedient if we all calmed down a bit? The mere thought of a Dagoth of all people being Hortator still made her shake her head at the state of the world sometimes, but such was life. The armored elf shrugged and raised his hand lackadaisically. Fine. Their ambushers ever so slowly lowered their weapons, even if they kept them unsheathed. Varana lowered her arms and happily strolled over to the table as the elf indicated for her to sit down. "Thank you. I am Varana, the leader of our little family. May I know your name?" "Davos," he answered simply, offering no further information. "And it is indeed a pleasure to meet you, Kingpin." Oh, they were far more informed than she thought. That was not good. Alandro Indaril paced atop the outer wall of Mournhold, finally having managed to get a moment for himself after he ensured the troops would not attempt anything. The task given to him was deceptively difficult, even with the expectations he himself carried, and it took all of his effort and attention to direct his now undermanned force to keep order. He was not foolish enough to understate the results of his work to the Hortator, but he felt obligated to obscure the effort it took so as to not needlessly stress the new leader of his people. Not that he doubted the elf was more than aware of everything happening around him at all times. Seers were terrifying to deal with. Still, he could not keep his frustration from constantly bubbling up under his skin. Even the fight for the throne of Necrom was won by a mere fluke, his mere association with the one who blessed the land, giving him just enough leverage to take the position while the family of the previous Grand Descendant squabbled amongst themselves. What followed only served to make him question his position more and more. The glories he expected when traveling to Old Ebonheart and later to Mournhold were still there, but with glory came the test of his own adequacy, a test he had failed terribly. Even now he remembered the hundreds of his own mer, dead and trampled under Argonian boots, simply because he could not follow a basic plan and hold back his assault by a few minutes. A lesson in humility, if there ever was one. But where there was failure, there was also a path to redemption, and when the Hortator, a mer far more worthy than he, told him his work was good, he felt all the pain and frustration worth it, and that he came out of it all a better mer. So why was he still feeling so uneasy? He would need to speak to Sodash. "You all right there, child?" An unfamiliar voice called out to him. He rounded on the newcomer, once more lambasting himself internally for missing the elf's approach, and it certainly was an elf, even if his armor was less than conventional. "Who are you?" Alandro asked him, surprised by his own reluctance to think the elf a lowly one. There was something about his aura that demanded respect. That, and he had seen him near the Hortator on multiple occasions, he would not rush to a conclusion just yet. Just a concerned passerby. The mer answered simply, "You seem troubled." Alandro felt like he should be honest with this individual for a reason he could not identify, but an enlightened individual did not foolishly follow his emotions at all times. And what is it to you who are afraid of showing his own face? Good try. The elf chuckled and unsheathed his blade, foregoing the odd hammer hanging off his belt, causing Alandro to immediately reach for his spear. "What do you want?" the young Grand Ascendant repeated. "Just curious, really." The armored elf swung his sword around lazily. "How far her blood has come." He turned on his heel, now pointing his blade at the descendant of Almalexia. "Come on then. You look like you have some frustrations to work through." Now this, Alandro was far more willing to do, especially if he got to wipe the grin off the smug prick's face in the process. Needless to say, by the time the armored warrior was done with him, the younger elf had reconsidered all of his life choices, had his life flash before his eyes at least 3 times, and was taught more about spearmanship by a swordsman than any of his instructors ever managed. As the unknown elf left him panting on the wall, beaten and bruised, Alandro felt like all his problems had suddenly become much lighter. And then a signal horn sounded, telling all of the approaching allied army. With a tired exhale, the Grand Ascendant jumped on his feet and began slowly healing himself. He had learned much in his time since he left the outskirts of Necrom. He wondered if his parents would recognize him by the time he returned. Chapter 4, 152. Chapter 71, The Deshan Campaign. Raven's point of view. The people of Mournhold cheered as the army paraded out of the city, our numbers now refilled and increased to a nice round 15,000 strong, creating a veritable sea of colourful banners that would have no doubt been followed by a cloud of dust, if not for a slight application of wind magic by yours truly. Varan Serrano's arrival signalled the end of my short stay in Mournhold, his 25,000-strong army taking over the task of garrisoning the city and occupying the numerous smaller settlements surrounding the area as my smaller but far more elite force went out to search and destroy as many enemy armies as possible. He was rather impressed by my current achievements and voiced his regret that he would not be leading the charge by my side. Still, he was more than content with his less glorious duty of actually occupying the land and beginning its integration, something he would then hand over to the Dres and the final wave of our forces as he kept tailing us. Well, at least once Aneris was done with her current task of advancing from the west and sweeping her forces around Lake Hlalu to the west of Deshan, an area left totally unprepared for an attack by the rapidly scrambling Argonian army stationed there. Hitting Mournhold and taking it before they could so much as realize we were there certainly gave the lizards a good scare. As we were leaving, I even noticed a 3,000-strong regiment flying the familiar banner of Kraganmore, all of them carrying the same long spears and armor I had given them, only they were now protected with additional layers and were all given one-handed sidearms in recognition of their bravery. To say that they were happy to see me would be the understatement of the year, and while I was tempted to bring them with me, they were still far too inexperienced for my current goals. And so it was that I left yet another conquest behind me. My soldiers and officers well-rested and well-equipped, all of them more than motivated to kick the Argonian invaders out of our lands once and for all. 'Twas time to play whack-a-mole with entire armies, and my reflexes would prove far faster than those of a gaggle of sentient trees. General P.O.5, The Fall of Selphora. The army of the Kingdom of Morrowind struck out after a mere 3-day stay in Mournhold, leaving behind a shaken but pacified city as they marched east to the smaller city of Selphora and the island fortress of Tal Dyke that blocked sea access to the Thur River, the same body of water that bordered Mournhold to its north and gave it access to the sea. The obvious supply route was deemed the most important target by both the Hortator and the slew of hardened Redoran tacticians that followed him, and the army was ordered to march down the riverside with utmost speed. A forced march was called even before the news of the Argonian response came, and only sped up once the army got word that a force of a proper Anzilil warband moving north from Thorn to reinforce Selphora. They reached the city days before its reinforcements came and besieged it, scything through the defenders on the walls of the hillside city with both magic and artillery and crushing the gate with a force of 12 automaton centurions, focusing most of the defenders on the western gate, even as a force under Merin Zadir of the Dres, combined with the warband of Dagoth Ulthis, scaled their eastern walls. Their successful infiltration shook the defenders' morale, and soon the city fell to panic as its now majorly Argonian population attempted to flee or fight for their perceived survival. The final nail in the coffin for the Argonian held Selphora was struck when the Hortator himself took to the field, flying over the walls atop his flaming familiar and raining down fire and lightning upon any point in the battle line where the enemy seemed to be gaining an advantage. Quarter was asked, and after only an hour of additional fighting given, the few hundreds of surrendered Argonian warriors swiftly moved to an outside camp, created with transmuted rock and placed under the watch of Alandro Indaril. As this was going on, the sworn Mer of Dagoth, with the vast majority of the Telvanni forces, made their way to the fort of Tel Daik, where under the cover of night they struck swiftly and terribly, leaving no survivors within the military base and opening the way for the Sadras fleet to deliver supplies to the front. A mere 2 days later, the An-Zilil war band under Chief Sizerk arrived and immediately retreated west to join with the remnants of what once was the army of Argonian-held Mournhold, taking only minor casualties to the constant harrying raids as they pulled back in good order. Western push and counterattack. To the west of the front, Anaris Dress led the least experienced part of Morrowind's army from the restored fortress of Andrethis and struck the city of Sekramora, taking it with some difficulty before meeting up with a small part of the army under Varan Sarano and besieging the city of Narcissus that overlooked Lake Hlalu and was once the capital of that self-same great house. The An-Zilil did not take all of this laying down, however, as more reinforcements surged from Black Marsh itself under the urging of the Council of Shamans, and with their numbers bolstered once more, they marched up the center and at Mournhold with an army of 70,000 strong. The barely rested force at Selphora, having been reunited with its other detachment mere hours before receiving the news, marched out once more, leaving behind their Dres compartment to watch over both city and prisoners. The following forced march stopped only a day before they reached the main road to Mournhold, giving themselves but half a day to rest before striking out once more, only to arrive at the site of an open battle. The Battle of Mournhold Hills. Days prior, Varan Sarano, knowing that Mournhold was not yet stable enough to truly hold off a siege, began sending out raids against the fresh Argonian army, slowing their advance by a full day before sallying out and meeting them in the field. He took the high ground on a hill some hours' march south of the new capital, a perfect position that overlooked all the easy paths north, and challenged the Argonian army by having the detachment of Telvanni under him bombard their force with long-range spells. His ploy seemed to work, and the Argonians formed up for battle, charging up the steep hill and meeting his mostly Redoran forces in a thunderous clash, overcoming part of the height advantage with sheer stubbornness and physical might. The Kraganmore regiment, coming to call itself the Hortator's own, to the chagrin of many, did a surprisingly good job at holding the left flank against enemy shock infantry, giving the defending army considerable breathing space as reserves meant to replace them, if and when they fell, could be used to head off other flanking attacks. The fighting was bloody, but by the end of the day the Redoran army held and the Argonians retreated to their now fortified camp, bloodied but nowhere near broken. A second sunrise saw the fighting reigniting with an increased ferocity, the lizardmen having had more than enough time to plan around the Dunmeri positions, attacking from all possible angles at the same time while delivering a constant stream of reinforcements to the front, so much so that the Telvanni bombardment failed to slow it down to any relevant degree. The instant the Dunmeri mages began faltering due to simple magicka exhaustion, the Argonians redoubled their efforts, their shamans controlling the still hist-influenced plant life to disrupt the Dunmeri formations to great effect. The Redoran force would have fallen then and there, if not for Archmaster Varan Serrano himself, taking to the field and leading a charge with his most trusted house nobles straight through the center of the enemy formation. They struck fast, and they struck hard, disrupting the attack and buying their kinsmen valuable time to reform. The Argonian chieftain took this as a challenge and struck with his own personal guard, threatening to overwhelm the counter-attacking force that even now faltered under the sheer weight of numbers their enemy carried. But when all seemed lost, a loud noise came from the east, and a golden shooting star cut through the skies, striking the Argonian flank in an explosion of brilliant golden flame, followed quickly by a quartet of figures cutting through the unlucky survivors like a scythe through grass. The sight of the Hortator and his 3 bodyguards taking on an entire flank on their own reinvigorated the spirits of the Dunmer, which was only bolstered when another army crested the eastern hill-rise, charging at the army of lizardmen without breaking their stride. The Argonian army was shaken, but what truly broke them was when Varan Serrano reached Chieftain Caesark and struck him down in a personal duel, completely overcoming his foe's physical superiority with pure skill and experience in such an absolute manner that his mere gaze made his enemies flee. To make things even worse for the Anciliel, their rear was then struck by a force of legion cavalry. Their colours slightly changed so as to not drag the Empire into the war, and a mind-boggling number of automatons, all of whom were led by Archmagister Baladas Demnevani. The old Telvanni had to burn many favours to get to play around with those marvels of magical engineering, but as he conducted the slaughter of thousands with barely any effort, he felt selling his soul would have been more than worth it for the experience. It is said that even the ever-proud members of his house were now terrified of the elf, all but a few of them thinking twice before so much as raising their voices in his presence. The Argonians broke and fled, and even as they left tens of thousands of bodies behind, they were saved from complete annihilation due to the simple fact the Dunmer were exhausted from days of fighting and forced marching, leaving only a few troops to pursue them. All in all, it was a grand victory for Morrowind, and yet it was also a costly one as 7,000 Dunmer lay slain before the day was through. Recovery. The Hortator, granted wisdom by the good Daedra, declared a pause in the campaign as his troops were too worn out by the rapid conflict. They retreated to Mournhold once more, where they oversaw the transfer of the few Argonian prisoners into a new camp near the city and the arrival of the Dres-led army. Aneris Dres managed to take the western city of Narcissus with moderate casualties, and her numerous force slowly began taking over garrison duties from the other armies, allowing the main strike force to reform and recuperate. 10 days passed as the units were refilled and reorganized. A new year greeted the lands of Nirn, followed by a short celebration at the behest of the Hortator, celebrating the first year of Morroind's return to prominence. Some still questioned their honored leader's connections to the humans of the Empire, but victory silenced all detractors, and the collective subconscious of Morrowind's people soon began changing without them even knowing. A tear in their flank. The army of Morrowind, now consisting of only 2 forces instead of 3, split up once more at Mournhold, as the force under Grand Magnate Aneris Dres, consisting of 40,000 elves, stayed behind to secure the new conquests, while the force of Hortator Raven Dagoth struck out south, now joined by Archmagister Varan Serrano and 30,000 strong. They moved southeast, now marching at a more reasonable pace as they aimed to take the minor city of Rithendis, before striking at the ancient capital of the Dres Tyr. Their enemy had grown wiser, however, and as the land turned more and more alike to that of Black Marsh itself, guerrilla attacks and raids by the Argonians became ever more common. No grand casualties were inflicted upon the army of Morrowind, but the constant attacks and minor losses wore upon morale, and the Hortator could only burn down so many forests before even his magic started looking impotent to his subjects. And so he deployed his own countermeasures. A special strike force under Legate Furious and Davos Dagoth was formed, granted the best supplies and maps of the area, and tasked with hunting down each and every enemy raiding party in advance. They faltered at first, but once they got used to the moist air and even wetter forests, they began extracting a grand toll upon the Argonians, even as they took losses themselves. The home field advantage was just too great to simply be ignored even by the most prepared of armies. Things took a turn, however, as rumors began to spread amongst the Argonian raiders of a dread beast in the night, of 8 legs and 8 eyes and skin of orichalcum. They spoke of diabolic chittering and of webs taking over their woods and devouring the souls of all who walked into them. Nimhe feasted well in those weeks indeed. Rithendis fell without much fanfare, the small city simply getting overwhelmed by volleys of crossbow fire and the piercing limbs of an automaton swarm, the easy victory bringing a much-needed reprieve to the mentally exhausted army of elves, even as their leaders grew apprehensive at the lack of competent resistance. They did wonder why the Hortator made the point of turning yet another great tree to ash, like he did at Selphora and all the other settlements they came upon. The march to Tyr came only a day of rest later, the troops left behind to garrison their most recent conquest, being both thankful and angry at being left out of even more trudging across muddy roads. The Hortators scrying, and the reports of the scouts brave enough to wade into the Thornmarsh, the northernmost domain of Blackmarsh, confirmed that another grand host was gathering in the city of Thorn, even as they left Rethendis, far outstripping both of the armies they faced previously. This only made reaching Tyr quickly that much more important, as the enemy obviously aimed to use the fatigue of the Dunmer to crush them once and for all. Once more the reconquering army was met with constant raids and harassment, as even the overgrowing forests seemed to fight their approach, but with grit and magic they pushed through, and they came upon the city of Tyr, only to find it utterly ruined, only a single massive tree standing where the proud Dres once held court, surrounded by barely visible ruins of what were once grand walls and towers. Raven the individual understood the reason, as the Dres were the main proponents of Argonian slavery for thousands of years. Raven the Hortator, however, made a show of extinguishing the Hist hub to the vindictive glee of his people, and called for a small celebration, as with the retaking of the ruins, Morrowind was once more whole. Well, there were still hundreds of minor settlements to retake and pacify, but they did not need to know that. All the major cities were in Dunmeri hands, and that was all that mattered. For now, march on the Thornmarsh. The Hortator held council with his subjects upon the ashes of the Hist hub, and a consensus was rapidly reached that the Argonians would not simply sit idly as the Dunmer consolidated the reconquered part of their kingdom, and would strike out once more and in force. A mountain range, relatively small in truth, separated Blackmarsh proper from the reunited kingdom of Morrowind, and a wide pass bridged the way between the two kingdoms, all other entrances being blocked by wide rivers and perilous crossings. It did not take much for all to agree that it was at this pass the fate of the war would be decided, and so after another day of rest, the army of Morrowind marched out once more, every single one of them sick and tired of the land that fought them even now, and every single one of them more than ready to take it all out on their enemy. Chapter 4, 153, Side Story 2, A Shift in Politics. General POV, one day after Raven was declared Hortator. The White Gold Tower was a hive of activity as the Elder Council assembled once more to discuss the path of the Empire of Tamriel and the pertinent events within and without its borders. The great circular throne room was filled to the brim as nobles, guild masters, mages and prominent merchants discussed amongst themselves and lobbied for influence, even as all their authority was taken out from under them without them even knowing. One fat nobleman found all of it quite ridiculous, even as he too worked to position himself as well as he could before the dice finally fell. Times had been tough on one Vitellius Tor and his small clique of high nobles. Ever since he had met the young Lord Dagoth, he had done his best to ingratiate himself with the new regime by working to cut off the influence of traitors or any excesses of his peers. It worked only some of the time, but his efforts had been noticed, and excepting the short instance where he nearly soiled himself as a fucking Morag Tong guildsman, visited him in his hidden and secret safe house without making a sound, he was now tentatively accepted as someone reliable by Titus and his influence block. Why, the entire situation was so stressful, he even ended up losing weight. What do you think all the excitement yesterday was about? The question of Countess Verena Eswood drew him from his thoughts. I heard a feast was organized in the upper palace, but no one seems to know why. I am afraid it is far too early to find that out, my dear, Vitellius muttered. Not even my network can wring the truth out of the penitus oculatus. His other friend, Julian Caris, scoffs but says nothing. The young man was looking downright strapping these days as he invested himself fully into training for combat. Vitellius found it all rather unnecessary, but he guessed his allies may have received visits of their own and left it at that. It matters little. Julian spoke after a moment. We will find out soon enough. And as if summoned by his words, the inner council of Titus Mede II stepped into the great chamber, followed closely by the emperor and the red-haired young woman that seemed to always be around whenever something of importance was happening. Vitellius rolled his eyes at the constant subterfuge, but found it to be one of Titus's brighter ideas. The elder council quieted down as the emperor ascended his throne and greeted them all with a raised hand. "My fellow citizens," he spoke with a smile, "I thank you all for coming to this meeting and ask your patience before we begin, as I have heartening news to share." Vitellius felt his fellow council members focus on the old man with a renewed intensity. A mere day prior, Titus continued as he took a seat upon the ruby throne. "We have received news from Morrowind, where our honored ally Lord Raven of Great House Dagoth has once more achieved what most would think impossible. My fellow citizens," he repeated as a genuine smile spread on his face, "our ally has ascended Red Mountain and ended its curse once and for all. Morrowind now stands restored, and their people shall prosper alongside our own." An immediate wave of noise overtook the chamber as questions began bombarding the emperor, but he ignored them all in favor of raising his hand once more to quieten them down. That is not all, however. Titus's smile turned downright vicious. "It has also been made known that all 6 great houses of Morrowind, alongside the temples of the Reclamations, have unilaterally declared Raven Dagoth to be Hortator of Morrowind, making him the sole and ultimate ruler of the province." A moment of silence, and then chaos. Vitellius found himself once more congratulating his own wisdom, even as his allies directed him with looks of thanks. He expected the elf to rise to ridiculous levels, but to be declared an absolute ruler of an entire people, that went beyond even his own predictions. For a good 10 minutes, the emperor was bombarded with questions as the councillors grew concerned with Morrowind fully seceding and with potential betrayals and economic knock-on effects. Titus answered as well as he could before he grew visibly annoyed when an accusation of probable treason was leveled for the 5th time. Once more he rose his hand and asked for calm. "Thank you." He did not sound thankful. "We understand that these news may not inspire all of you with confidence. That is, after all, a reasonable conclusion. But our honored ally attaining power is not the sole reason I have chosen to speak today. Minthara, my dear," he looked to the red-haired Nord woman, who Vitellius now realized was dressed far more opulently than usual, "do step up." Without hesitation and with confidence in each step, the demigoddess walked up the steps of the ruby throne, and the council chambers turned deathly silent as Titus stood up before her. He faced the elder council and spoke. "For many years now, you have wisely told me to find a successor to inherit my position before something unfortunate happened, something I have delayed over and over again in my search of perfection." His smile turned slightly cruel as realization began to spread through the crowd. "It is my utmost honor to thus declare that by right of both blood and faith, the House of Mead has adopted this child into its ranks as my daughter, even if her own blood is far beyond that of this meager mortal." He turned to the perfectly calm redhead, Minthara Dragonbane Septim. The crowd made a collective intake of breath. "Do you accept this choice and the responsibilities it carries?" "I do." She smiled, once more not showing the slightest hint of hesitation. The emperor smiled and turned to the stunned council, his expression shifting into pure steel as he slowly and meticulously looked them all in the eye. "Kneel before your crown princess." Vitellius did as he was bid, but he still felt some fools standing in either confusion or defiance. And then the girl pulled out the god's damned amulet of kings. Truly, Vitellius thought, his foresight was immaculate. The city of Solitude shook as its streets were overtaken with rowdy Nords. Ale and mead flowed, and savings were thrown away as a feast nearing the grandeur of the defeat of Alduin swiftly spread throughout its many districts and soon to the other cities of the province by way of magic. The entirety of Skyrim paused on that day. Incidentally, 9 months later, the population of the province would receive a sudden and considerable bump. The many petty rulers of High Rock paid lip service to the new declaration from Cyrodiil, and then promptly returned to their little conflicts and politicking, letting the rest of Tamriel move on without them, as they did for centuries prior. All save a singular city where a group of knights just returned from culling a large tribe of reachmen, and their leader met with his king, and they concocted a plan that would see their city rise above all others in their province. But that was a tale for another time. The news washed over Hammerfell with a distinct slowness characteristic to this part of the world, whereupon they went utterly ignored as the crowns and forebears kept killing each other, the Thalmor, and themselves. Kinlord Narcissus paced across his chambers under the worried gaze of his daughter. An open letter lay upon his desk, brought directly to him by emergency courier from the manor in the imperial city that now served as a concealed embassy. The news left him feeling rather ambiguous about everything. On the one hand, it increased his chances of survival since he was a point of contact with the newly rising power, while on the other, it could be used to heap blame upon him as he offered some minor aid to the new Hortator in the past. It was not aid, it was a trade, he reassured himself, nodding forcefully so as to dispel numerous panicked thoughts from consuming him. His daughter could not take it anymore and spoke up, "Father, what?" "Be silent," he rounded on her with fury clear in his eyes. If not for this foolish excuse of a daughter, he would never have been in this situation. She practically wilted under his gaze and slinked back into a corner of the room. His trial was coming today, and he found the fact quite grating on his manners. He would have to make it up to her if he lived. A knock on his door drew his attention. Enter. His most loyal personal servant came in and offered a shallow bow. "Kinlord, a guest has arrived petitioning to meet you." "Who is it?" Narcissus asked clippedly. The servant hesitated for a moment before speaking. "High Justiciar Finarfin and his entourage." Narcissus frowned. He was supposed to be collected tomorrow, not because of any respect for his position, but because the other kinlords would grow furious if one of their number was treated with such disdain. "Send him up." He ordered after a moment. He suspected he would be given an offer, one he was likely to be unable to refuse, and prepare some refreshments. "Your wish is my command." The servant bowed and left. He looked to his daughter, Neris. She twitched in fear, but still spoke calmly as she was taught, "Yes, father." He considered softening the blow, but thought better of it. "Go to your rooms. It would be best if you remained out of sight." She wilted once more, the idea he did not trust her to stand by his side, worse than any physical harm he may have inflicted. She left the room without a word. "You will make her understand," he assured himself. "This is all to protect her." With shaky steps, he sat behind his study table, carefully folding the letter and placing it into a drawer before locking it. The silence felt deafening as he awaited for his guest, making him nearly jump out of his skin as the doors were once more knocked on and his servant opened them after his instinctual call to enter. In behind came a singular figure, bereft of his guards or any followers, but still terrifyingly formidable. The High Justiciar gave Narcissus one quick look before skipping all niceties and preambles and speaking, "You have received the news, have you not?" Narcissus nearly told him off for his audacity, but held back, "I have." He thanked the Aedra as his voice failed to shake. "Both developments are rather unfortunate for our long-term plans, but neither was fully unexpected." "Is that so?" Finarfin quirked a mocking eyebrow, the High Justiciar obviously provoking a reaction and smiling thinly as his target failed to bite. "I trust that the situation caused by your repeated failings has left you rather high-strung, so I shall be blunt." Oh, how Narcissus wished to wipe the smug look from the bastard's face. His next words nearly had the kinlord reaching for a blade. "If things continue as they are, you will be blamed for our economy grinding into a halt, and both you and your daughter would die." "You stay away from her, you bastard," Narcissus hissed as he stood up, his long, unused magicka bubbling under his skin as he glared at the Thalmor. The High Justiciar merely raised an eyebrow, and suddenly the kinlord felt himself drowning under the suffocating pressure, the near assault stopping only once he fell back into his seat as if a puppet with its strings cut. "Don't bark when you cannot bite, Narcissus," Finarfin drawled, "and I will do as I wish, no matter how loudly you whimper." Gritting his teeth to preserve at least a bit of dignity, Narcissus looked up and asked, "What do you want?" "Your absolute and unconditional support." Finarfin smiled. "Our enemies grow in power, and you yourself are not fool enough to think they will not strike when they feel themselves ready." The Thalmor Council bickers like fools, satisfied with the minor victory we won in the last war like the foolish children that they are. I find this state of affairs unacceptable. He stated with a finality, if I pull some strings to see you and your family safe, you will support my bid for Overlord to the full capacity of your influence, and that is including all of your alliances and favors owed. What is your answer? Serve or die, was it? Narcissus thought blithely. How very novel. His sarcastic thoughts must have shown on his face, for Finarfin narrowed his eyes. But Narcissus was not an idiot, and he knew this was likely his only chance at survival, and more importantly, for the survival of Nyris. Very well, he said, in return for absolute clemency, I will aid your goals. Demanding, are we? Finarfin drawled. But do not worry, I will stop them from taking your lands instead of your life. It would not do for your influence to disappear, now that it is but an extension of my own. Quite, Naris drawled back. The High Justiciar scoffed, I do have a task for you before I leave. Consider it a test of your usefulness. Keeping back a scowl, Narcissus asked, What do you want? I need you to compose a missive. Finarfin smiled. You are a capable diplomat despite your failings, and I find myself lacking in this area of governance. The humility of the Thalmor did not sound the slightest bit humble to the aristocrat's ears. You are to compose a letter to Piendonia and draw them in for a meeting. Narcissus felt a headache growing. Piendonia? Do you take me for a miracle worker? I take you for someone serving in my interests. The future Thalmor overlord smiled. So you better get to serving, or else. As he was left to stew in his study, Narcissus took all of the rage and humiliation he felt and let it simmer down and cool. He would keep serving like a good dog. For now. Chapter 4, 154, Chapter 72, Battle at Thorn Pass, Prelude. Raven's point of view. I looked down upon a vast mountain pass, risen well above sea level and thus much less marshy than I had grown used to in the past 2-ish months of campaigning. Even if a light mist still covered it, even during a day I dare call drier than usual. 54 days. The mutter leaves me unbidden. My sole companion looks at me, We managed to take back Deshan in 54 days. I elaborate, merely taking it all in. Certainly something for the history books. Savos grins, his genuine pride requiring no magic to be felt in the air. Nodding at the simple truth, I can't help but point out, we haven't won just yet. True, true. He allows, best not relax before we see all the Hist is willing to throw at us. A silent moment passes before I say, it is a shame, though. That we cannot strike further, Savos guesses. Quite. I sigh. Taking land under far greater Hist influence would be a nightmare. We already lost nearly 3,000 to sheer attrition and ambushes. Just imagine how bad it would get if we tried counter-invading. A nightmare indeed. He hums. The simplest solution comes to me easily. That just means I will have to make a sufficient statement in the coming battle. He perks up. Oh? Turning fully to Savos, I grin maliciously. It means that I will have to lay upon them such terror and slaughter that even their tree gods will have no choice but to accept my terms for peace, for the mere thought of continuing to fight me will see them quaking in their roots. He stays silent for a long moment before frowning, so long as you know what you are doing. I could see the truth of his concern, and I could understand it. He was afraid I would go further off the deep end than I already was, but some things simply needed to be done. Oh, trust me. I scoff and turn back to the valley, where even now Demnevani was directing the automaton swarm in pre-battle preparation. I have been holding back this entire time. I wish to truly unleash just as much as I feel I will be forced to. He was obviously not all that comforted by the idea, but still accepted it as fact. After yet another bout of silence, he spoke again. Raven, about what happened in the mountain. Finally ready to talk about it. I give him a smug-ass grin. He scoffs. You can't just throw something like that at a Mer and expect him to simply accept it. I can't help but chuckle at this, draining some wind from his sails instantly. Do tell me, what changes have you experienced? His internal nerd swiftly overtakes his worry as he tugs on his beard. Mostly improved affinity for fire and restoration in general, and an odd respect from my Dremora summons, they almost seem hesitant to insult me or challenge me now. "How much did you test this?" I ask. "Extensively." He grins. "I could go into specifics, but not until you tell me what was going on." "Fine, fine." I raise my hands in faux surrender. "You are well aware of the potency of my bloodline by now." He nods. "Well, during my most recent misadventures, that bloodline has been empowered over and over and went from something useful to something tangibly powerful." I spread my arms dramatically. The ritual within Red Mountain was but the final step to my ascension. "So," he speaks up after a full 2 minutes of silent staring, "nothing dangerous then?" My final statement finally catches up to me and he blinks. "Also ascension?" "Simply put, I am technically no longer Dunmer." I grin at him. His expression turns flat. "What?" Offering him a sufficiently theatrical bow and ensuring no one was listening, I say, "Be honored, Gramps, for you stand before the sole living Aelnofe on Nirn." And in that instant, my mortal form shifts to something closer to my soul form, going from something mortal to something distinctly more. Without a word, he summons a chair and slumps back into it, as if a puppet with its strings cut. He spends another long period in complete silence as he outright gapes at me before scowling, "Bullshit." "Nah. I grin as my form reverts. "You felt the proof yourself." He begins muttering to himself before looking back at me. I am both proud and utterly terrified right now. "Most interesting." I drawl with my eyebrows raised. "Now about those specifics." He pauses before deflating. "Fine." In the end, I learned my blessing, the full-powered one I gave to Savos, when I accidentally made him my chosen equivalent. Whoops. Gave boosts corresponding to each and every one of my aspects, going from giving his fire physical weight and having a yet undiscovered interaction with Ash, imbuing Daedra with a feeling of danger and potentially being able to harm them, granting both resistance and power to illusions, and empowering Restoration's healing aspects. The oddest one of the bunch was what came from my mortality aspect. As Savos said, he had been feeling far more grounded recently and found himself unbothered by the usual rapid passage of time older elves tended to experience. All in all, I was impressed with what I managed to achieve with what was basically an instinctual divine spell. Now to refine it to hell and back and make my most loyal followers even more ridiculous than they already were. General POV. He stalked through the crowds of his egg brothers with all the grace of a raging salamander, causing many of them to slink away in instinctual fright as they heard his near-constant wordless growl. He had returned to his homeland in shame and humiliation, and yet that he returned was a victory in and of itself. He expected to be punished for his failings, used to display the folly of his ways and those of his comrades by the shamans who even now resisted his command's iron grip. And yet instead he had been called by the Hist itself, recognized as the most powerful defender of his people, and given a task to right the wrongs he had suffered and stop the grey-skinned filth from ever encroaching upon his kin again. To most, it would have been a heady feeling, an ascension in all but name, as he was once more transformed even further and inured with the power of his creators to become the ultimate warrior. He grew larger, his muscles were as coiling steel, his claws as swords, and his scales as thick as a dragon's, and he was clad in armor of Aedra crystal and Daedra vitae. So empowered was he that his wounds would heal in an instant, and even a decapitation became a mere inconvenience. To others, it would most certainly look like the most exalted of existences, even as said exaltation took its toll without mercy or consideration. Warchief Valazar of the Anzilil no longer slept, could no longer lose focus and relax, or enjoy life's simple pleasures. He was turned from mere drone to a tool of perfected purpose, and granted honors beyond any of his kin. So why was it that in those rare moments he could close his eyes, he felt like his fate was the exact opposite of a reward? It did not matter, he decided simply, his failings had created the necessity of his reward, and he would not shame himself again by questioning it again. He passed through another group of warriors. These egg brothers were armored in steel, imported from the Golden Elves, and taught to fight in disciplined ranks, much unlike the majority of his kin. The Anzilil side of him felt naught but disgust at the sight, while the side that was defeated and crushed before the walls of Kraganmore appreciated the efficiency they would bring to his army. He reached his command tent just as the scouts returned from their ranging, notably lacking 4/5 of their initial number, and reported that the Greyskin army was but half a day's march away through the cursedly dry pass before them. The fact they reached it before his force gnawed at him terribly, but he had grown cynical in his expectations and showed no surprise whatsoever. The enemy was more crafty than he, so he would have to overwhelm them with grit and power. It had become that simple to his permanently exhausted mind. His loud steps drew the attention of the dozens of shamans and chieftains within the large magically grown tent, and he wasted no time in speaking. "Did you manage to get eyes on the enemy numbers?" The clicking tick his voice had developed recently no doubt unsettled his kin, but he found himself unable to care, even as he saw one of the scouts outraged at him, ignoring their loss. Their leader was far more disciplined, however, and gave his prompt report. "Only from a long distance, War Chief. The hunter beast we have received reports of from the skirmishers still in Deshan seems to have moved with the army and has managed to take down most of us before we could get close." Valazar felt tempted to mock his for his failings, but realized that would grate on morale, so instead he asked, "If I were to order you to gather a band to hunt it down, would you be capable?" The scout stilled, visibly looking like he wanted to beg for him to reconsider, but he had his pride still. "It is possible." He began, "I cannot guarantee it, but the beast leaves tracks that are easy enough to follow." "Do so," Valazar commanded without hesitation or sympathy, and gave the egg brother no moment of respite. "What of the army?" The Argonian shook slightly and calmed himself with a short breath. "They have formed camp atop the highest point of the valley, slightly north of the center. They have already raised basic fortifications, and considering the presence of the slaver magi, I would not be surprised if the entire area is left ridden with traps." Valazar let out a long clicking hiss as his mind began drawing an image of the situation. And what of smaller passes? How capable are we of flanking the enemy? He knew there were still some troops stuck to the north, but their timing would have to be immaculate if they were ever to be of any use. A consideration he would not give those who lost battle after battle. Instead of the scout, one of his chieftains and fellow Anzilil responded, the stocky egg brother being one of the rare kin that did not look upon him with fear. There are a few known to exist, but their exact locations were never mapped. "Then have them mapped," Valazar immediately snapped back. "You, scout." The veteran scout stood at attention. "You will gather a hunting band as soon as possible." He growled, "Take as many as you need, but do not return without those maps." The scout gulped but still saluted. "Yes, War Chief." "And you?" He turned to the chieftain that spoke previously. "Ask around the camp for any of our kin who pass through here frequently. They may know more." His egg brother nodded. "Yes." Finally, he turned to the last group of note present, and to the same shaman who had failed him and his army at the gates of the enemy. "Are you capable of protecting us this time, or should we expect to burn once more?" The woman looked just about ready to rip out his heart for forcing so many of her fellows out of their tribes and their peaceful lives, an act they remained hesitant about even now that the Hist itself commanded them. How a caste with the greatest connection to their creators could disdain them so much he could never understand. Still, the failure of a shaman managed to get her bearings in the end and hissed out, "We will do our duty." He leaned forward, towering over her utterly, "See that you do." She could not hold back a gulp of fear, even as she stood her ground. Valazar turned to his chieftains, the sole members of the army he held actual respect for, and spoke, "The Greyskins." He hissed and clicked, "Think they can rise again, that they can once more lord themselves over us and take lands that no longer welcome their filth. Do not hesitate," he ordered simply, "show no mercy." His fellow warriors stomped the ground, "No mercy." He left the tent hours later, barely satisfied with the plan his egg brothers had come up with, before he left to contact the fourth and final faction of his army. Slaying Magi in battle was never the wisest option, and the Argonians of Black Marsh were wise enough to create a tool for the job. The mood in the Dunmeri camp was far more jovial than that of their opponents, as soldiers moved about, with by now ingrained precision, sharing japes and stories, all the while working to improve their fortification to its utmost efficiency. Even after nearly 2 full months of campaigning, the discipline of the Dark Elves and few Imperials who yet remained near immaculate. Their weapons were clean and well-oiled, and their armors free of dust and grime. The lands of the Hist attempted to poison their minds and their bodies, but the elves of Morrowind laughed at the attempt with the grim determination of 2 centuries of conflict. Even the Sworn Mer, a group of relative newcomers, swiftly ingrained themselves into the mindset of defeating the oppressors of their people once and for all. Not as grand a jump as one may think, considering their previous treatment in Windhelm. That no grand slaughter of the civilian Argonian populace happened so far was a miracle, and a sign of how deeply the words of their Hortator were already ingrained within all of them. Victory after victory, restoration after restoration, broken false idol after broken false idol. One could only follow an elf and see him do things considered pipe dreams for centuries on a near-daily basis and refute their beliefs a few times before realizing how utterly idiotic they were looking and behaving and falling back in line. All of this added up to a palpable sense of excitement across the camp, as the exhausted troops and their camp followers were filled with a second wind to complete their tasks and return home in triumph. And in the center of it all, their leaders assembled around the figure that made it all possible. Gentlemen, the Hortator spoke with an eagerness in his voice, and ladies. He inclined his head to a group of particularly grumpy old Telvanni mages. Our enemy already scrambles at the sight of us. Even now they attempt to observe us and are hunted down like the rats they are. Beside him a familiar Indoril elf scribbled his words down, the young priest having rejoined with the army back in Mournhold, his quill not shaking one bit, even as the nobility around him roared their approval. But they will not reach us just yet. The Hortator went on. We have all worked hard, our weapons are ready, the pits of death are waiting to be filled, and the good Daedra look down upon us awaiting our inevitable victory. So join me in this one toast before we all retire to rest. The young elf smiled at them. For tomorrow we will butcher those who would see our kin enslaved and our culture extinguished. He rose a cup of wine. For Morrowind. For Morrowind. Chapter 455. Chapter 73. Battle at Thorn Pass. Armies clash. Raven's point of view. The 10th day of sun's dawn of the year 201 of the 4th era was an eerily peaceful one, the morning mists lifting comfortably and wakefulness coming to my army without any issue. It was almost anticlimactic that no air of pre-battle jitters had overtaken the camp, probably to do with the small fact all that could have been done to prepare had been done, and months of campaigning had taught its lessons 10 times over. No one in this army was a recruit, and if they were to begin with, they certainly were not anymore. I teleported up atop the transmuted bastion tower that served as our command center, placed at the tallest point within our camp, and greeted the gathered officers with a nod. The enemy approaches. Varan Serrano spoke without turning around, his eyes far too focused on the coming horde to bother. Their numbers are great, almost too great. Letting out a whistle, I do a quick scry of their positions. That sure is a lot of beasts. Bah, Demnavani scoffs from his seat nearby. Numbers will not save them. That they will not. I smirk at the bored-looking Archmagister. What has Fear been up to? He rolls his eyes at the mere mention of the name. Fucker helped me out with the traps and decided he'd guard the rear. That is just about the agreement we made. I shrug. He would not be instrumental in the fight, and I had no doubts he would join in when he felt it wisest. Throwing the useless thoughts to the back of my mind, I turn to the other leaders present. Have the Argonians offered any kind of parley? Shaking heads and disdainful scoffs are the immediate responses, but it is Alandro Indoril who asks, "Do you want to negotiate with them?" He seemed genuinely baffled by the idea. One cannot end a war without making the other side accept their demands, I point out, and the wiser of my advisors nod along. Besides, parleys have other uses. A malicious thought occurs, and soon I am moving to action. General POV. The army of the Anzilil was tense as it marched towards the enemy camp. The reports of complete losses amongst the scouts on the western cliffs and massive casualties on the eastern ones had already made discontent begin to brew within the hearts of the foot soldiers. The supposed rumors that the great war chief had beheaded the sole scout who returned with the maps for cowardice only exacerbated the issue, but none were quite so foolish as to comment about it to the now truly monstrous creature that was once their greatest champion. Their march slowed to a halt as the Dunmer camp came into view, and the sight of it made a fair few of them shiver in fear at the task before them. For instead of simple wooden walls they had come to expect from the elves, they were greeted with rows upon rows of low walls and trenches, and numerous obstacles spaced out between them so as to make any kind of approach an instant death sentence to the first 1,000 who tried. And that was without mentioning their height advantage. The army of just under 30,000 elves never looked quite so menacing to the horde of well over 4 times their number. In fact, some of the chieftains and claw leaders began thinking that the great war chief may call off the attack so that they could maneuver into a better striking position. Even said giant lizard thought the same. That was until a golden streak cut through the skies, causing many of those who had experienced battle to tense in fear and the shamans to ready their shields and protections. But no grand explosion of fire came as the dreaded bird landed softly before their numerous thousands and just stared at them. Valazar considered just having the bird shot to pieces, but a slight twinge from his connection to the hist told him he should hear what it had to say. His patrons were not yet in concert as to how to treat their enemy, and more direct information was always useful. He stepped through the ranks, making sure to drag a dozen shaman warders behind him, and faced the creature. "What do you want?" he growled in his broken Tamrielic. The firebird tilted its head and chirped something unintelligible before speaking with what Valazar was quite certain was pure mockery. "Rejoice, farm tools, for you have been blessed with a visit from the great Scorch." "Don't strike the messenger," Valazar repeated in his mind over and over again. It went on as if it didn't notice him twitch. "I have come to graciously accept your surrender." He could swear the damn bird was grinning at him, but still managed to remain calm enough to speak. "Why would we surrender to those who invade our lands?" "Invade your lands?" The bird once more chirped. "Deshan is rightful Morrowind Clay Noir." "Don't fucking kill the messenger," he growled internally. "It has not been Dunmerry for over 200 years already." Valazar points out, even as his muscles twitched, and begged him to just charge and break and kill. "Just because your masters once ruled here does not give them the right to invade us." The bird stared at him for a long moment before shrugging its wings. "Don't play stupid, even if you are good at it. This is a counterattack, and you know it." "So why pretend to not know our intentions then?" Valazar growled. "Oh, that?" it asked before having its eyes take on a malicious glint that made Valazar slowly grip for his hammer. "To piss you off, of course." In the next instant his hearing was overtaken with roaring flames and the telltale sound of warding magic. But he had no time for that, as his mind and soul roared at the insulting betrayal, his sight turning red as he gave his command to attack. Raven's point of view. "And that is another scratch of the Geneva suggestion list," I mentally cackle as I hear the poor fucker roaring in rage and feel Scorch rematerialize inside of my magicka pool. "And that, gentlemen, is how you provoke a dumbass into killing his own army." Serrano's eyes met mine, an underhanded tactic. But an effective one, I point out, even if I understood his misgivings. "Ignore him," Demnavani scoffs. "The animals deserve no consideration." There was some back and forth between the two, but the conversation went ignored by most of us as the enemy army went from a slow march to a near run, still mindful enough to split off into their cohort equivalents instead of going fully mad and just rushing at us. As the earth began shaking underneath us, I turned deathly serious. "To your positions, we have a battle to win." The high officers of my army immediately began shuffling out, soon leaving behind only a small command staff of lesser leaders, Demnavani and myself. "I will fetch the scepter then." The Telvanni lord rubbed his hands eagerly as he was once more given my toys to play with. He was oddly proficient with that, now that I think on it. My sight beyond sight and the void's blink gave me a perfect overview of the battlefield as I stood atop the command tower, each and every enemy move presented to me in a perfectly organized information packet ready for consumption by my ravenous mind. With blinding speed, I began giving out orders, reshuffling reserve troops, and giving out warnings, ordering supplies to where the fighting would be hardest, and generally optimizing the incoming clash to the most ridiculous degree possible. Our western right flank was made completely safe by Nimi's actions, and was made up of the vast majority of my sworn mer, accompanied as they were by Falmer healers and a group of Telvanni mages. Anandor was also placed there, even as he protested being unable to guard my back. The eastern left flank was made up of a mix of Dress, Sadras, and Ashlander forces, and threatened by a passage in the mountains, one that I purposefully let be found out so that the enemy would invest forces uselessly. Only the unmourned were left to defend that place, only them and one very pissed-off automaton. He still wasn't over the fact he failed to body the White Argonian, though slapping Vivek helped a lot. Our centre, and the place of no doubt greatest conflict, was made up of a mix of Redoran and Indoril troops, all of them more than happy to take the brunt of the attack, as they perceived it as a great honour and place of glory. Which admittedly it was, I was just a cynical bastard about it. They were also joined by a certain Dwemer armour, wearing no name, that was seen chugging down unreasonable amounts of elixirs before battle came. So I could rest easy, they would not fall without a fight. The enemy army entered artillery range, one we had spent the past night marking out to meticulous detail, and in an instant Regnild Sadras had our many scorpions raining hell on them, quickly joined by a battery of my own Dwemer ballistae, all of whom were equipped with gatecrasher-grade explosive bolts. Our attack was so forceful it looked like the enemy army was suddenly covered in a bloody rain, even if the corpses were simply ran over, alongside those Argonians too scared to take another step. The Telvanni Magi and those of my own house still held back even as the clumps of enemy troops came closer, conserving their magicka for when they would well and truly rend them asunder. The Argonian shamans cast a large-scale earth spell as I predicted, and I felt their magic burrowing to the numerous traps we had placed underground. I allowed this as they were mere shallow pitfalls made to slow down their advance, and promptly rewarded the mages for their efforts by following the connection of their magicka and bombarding their positions with beams of fire from above. The vortex spell I cast at Kraganmore had been refined greatly in my free time, and the rain of crackling laser bombs proved that a fact thrice over. I could feel the same mage who fought me at Kraganmore blocking my attack, but she was no longer powerful enough to register as a speed bump, and her wards were soon cracked through and the Terramancers given their due. The shamans panicked, and I suddenly felt all of them channeling their magic into a collective ward, powerful enough to stop me from outright annihilating their reserves, but not much more than that. A condition I gladly accepted as I began scything through the ranks of the charging lizards, either simply disintegrating them with skyborn lightning or impaling them on rapidly transforming steel spikes, making their fellow beastfolk impale them further by suddenly running into their backs. The fools thought they had a chance, even as I felt my magical grip firmly encompass my entire army. Their battered front lines soon reached my own, and were greeted by rows upon rows of shallow ridges and trenches, dug out in such a way as to make a proper charge nigh on impossible, and make even walking a challenge. But I was not yet done. Oh no, I needed to make a statement here. I needed to make them understand. With Surge in my hand, I reached out with my magic, connecting lightly to the thousands of soldiers whose loyalty I could feel on a tangible level, and pushed. Numerous Dunmer along the front line flinched minutely as they felt strength surging within their veins and felt their skin turn to stone and their blades be set alight with an enchantment of fire temporarily powered by myself. I could practically taste their elation in the air as the first Argonian who survived the constant barrage of artillery and crossbow bolts reached the front line and was promptly cut to pieces by the rows of spears and swords. many of whom were now empowered well beyond their usual might to strike down my enemies. It was inevitable, however, that no matter how many were slain, the Argonian numbers would make their value known, and a heavy melee spread out across the entire front line, our formations barely holding together while their rampant assault threatened to break through with each passing second. Which is exactly when I felt Savos finish his spell and saw thousands of Dremora appear amongst the lizardmen. The distinctly good Daedra-aligned demon creatures immediately fell upon them with all the enthusiasm of a rabid dog and tore through thousands before they were put down. Savos's gambit crushed many and bought us minutes of advantaged battle, and while he would continue summoning throughout the battle, he was now lessened on a strategic level. But I could not spend my entire time watching my grandfather fight for his life and focused elsewhere, at a point where a group of Dres spear elves were nearly pushed back fully and their formation broken through. Not a catastrophic event, but also not one I would allow to happen. Dem Navani, I commanded, and slammed his mind with the relevant information. The Telvanni groaned in surprise, but soon I could see him directing a dozen of my recently crafted centurions to reinforce those ranks, their large hammer hands and flamethrower mouths searing through the Argonians, while their armor allowed them to hold their ground without being overwhelmed. Within a minute, I saw Sadras redirect the artillery to that position, and the Dres lines were fully reformed, yet still weakened enough to take the centurions' attention for a long while. The first hour passed thus. General Pio. He felt his heart thundering in his ear as his suddenly flaming spear pierced through an Argonian and pushed the creature behind it back, his arms vibrating with strength he did not know as he was forced to hold back from simply charging forth and impaling as many of them as possible. A fresh surge pushed his spear back, and he quickly yanked out his saber, cutting through the head of an Argonian that attempted to leap at his comrade, only to himself be rescued as the elf behind him struck the beast in the throat. Earl of Kraganmore, once cobbler now warrior, picked his spear back up and kept the saber he inherited from his friend and mentor in his other, stabbing and cutting for what felt like hours, but he knew were mere minutes, not once taking a step back. He and his fellow Kraganmore elves were only emboldened as the truly worthy of their number began summoning ancestral spirits, cutting through the lizards with no concern for their own safety. They were already dead, and it would not do to not drag back as many with them as possible. Earl's heart thundered on in his ears, but it was not fear that made him quake so, but exultation, for today he joined the ranks of heroes. Up and down, Nerevar's hammer crushed everything it touched as the sea of scaled flesh attempted to drown him, only to itself be split with barely any effort. His magicka surged under him, shuffling the ground and channeling the spilt blood of his enemies into draining spells that made his hammer as light as a feather while making each strike a roar of thunder. It did not matter what came to face him as he continued his rhythmic movements. Mounts were crushed, shields were shattered, weapons broken, and Argonians died. 1, then 10, then 100. He stopped counting somewhere around 350. It was, after all, just another day at work. Davos leaned back against a storage shack, holding a massive amount of artillery munitions, his hand moving to his mouth as he yawned lazily, ignoring the explosions and screams some few hundreds of meters south of him. His current job was to be the dumbass supply guard, and that is the job he would do, even if he would prefer to be out there and guarding the kid's back. Shaking the thoughts away, he focused his gaze forward as a figure approached. A noticeably nondescript Dunmer fellow that walked up to him with an easy grin and a scroll of parchment. "Hail there, brother." "Eh?" Davos looked up. "What do you want?" The elf grinned. "New guard shift. You can go join the front lines. No." He did not get to finish the sentence as Davos stabbed him through the throat, still looking as bored as ever, even as the Dunmer transformed into a black-shrouded Argonian. "Toss him with the rest of them," he ordered, and a pair of his fellow guildsmen ran up and dragged the fool away. With another yawn, Davos picked up his crossbow and began walking to the next spot his boss warned him about. Scrying really took the fun out of everything, he found. Dagoth Ulthis of the tribe, unmourned, kicked the corpse of the final animal off his ancestral blade with disdainful ease, his magic channeling his strength to new heights as he turned to count his kinsmen and potential casualties, this the last of them. He asked the silent automaton. In front of the aptly named Akulakan stood dozens of broken corpses, of champions and veterans of all kinds from amongst the enemy number. Yet all the magical mechanism did was look on with the disdain Ulthis himself felt deep within his heart. These beasts were unworthy of facing their lord. That he had to bother with them was insulting. "You serve your purpose well, meatbags." Akulakan the Younger spoke in his usual booming voice, his words the highest praise Ulthis heard him give. "We may return to the reserve." Ulthis scoffed and sheathed his blade, ordering the remaining 300 of his kinsmen to carry the few dozen they had lost. He did not even consider sifting through the thousands of fools who had attempted to flank their mighty army. Such unworthy warriors would not have worthy trophies. And then the distant earth shook, and they were no longer strolling back but sprinting. Raven's point of view. Once the enemy had clumped up enough, and their backlines began pushing their front lines, hoping to overwhelm us and break through with their very bodies, I sent the signal to the Telvanni and felt all of them cast their spells at once. For while I may have allowed the numerous pitfall traps to be destroyed by the shamans, I did not allow them to disturb the runes that awaited below, and thus the true trap was revealed. Suddenly the entire battlefield shook as storms of fire ice and lightning overtook the enemy army, the screams and smells of panic almost deafening the sounds of battle as thousands upon thousands died in seconds. The enemy army buckled, and just as they were about to begin fleeing, I felt a wave of something come from the enemy camp, making the Argonians pause even as hundreds died, and suddenly throw themselves at us like the rabid animals they now were. So that is the hist. I narrowed my eyes as the multiple presences focused on my position, and I felt my mind come under assault. A lesser one would have broken in seconds, but the trees were too far to affect me in any real way, except exert some minor pressure to my protections. It was still incredibly fucking annoying, and so I began weaving together illusion spells, copying the feel the hist was presenting so eagerly, and blasting the entire Argonian front line with it. They were at each other's throats in an instant. Hundreds died before I felt the tree fuckers begrudgingly retreat and reassert their influence on their troops. But I was not so generous as to let them go without reprisal, and I focused all of my considerable power into striking at any chink in their proverbial armor, as the moment they looked away from their troops the very same event would happen once more. It was incredibly satisfying to my petty soul to fuck with them like this, and after a while I could swear they knew it, as their forces turned even more feral, which also played right into my hands. See, Argonians growing stronger and more aggressive would be a game-changer in any other battle. But when faced with professional veteran soldiers who had just gone through a campaign and were buffed to hell, and back their increased strength only served to throw them atop my spears more quickly. And so the slaughter continued, for hours. At one point I had to order a controlled retreat because the Argonian bodies had piled up so much they were getting a height advantage, and they were beginning to simply jump over my formations. I bathed the entire front line in ravenous hemomantic fire that consumed the blood of the fallen and gave my troops a full minute to reorganize, replacing the now exhausted front lines with fresh and eager warriors while the others went back to rest. But the lull was just that in the end, a lull. The hist and its minions were not foolish enough to give us more time, and the moment the spell ran out of time they charged through, the large salamander mounts of their cavalry almost ignoring the terrain issues as they slithered forward and slammed into my ranks once more. They were slaughtered in seconds, and yet they still managed to inflict damage that had begun to accumulate as the battle went on, and would no doubt become unsustainable before the day was out. They had the bodies to throw away, and the will to do it. I did not. Even with my automatons constantly swarming each and every buckling position, even with the very ancestors of my soldiers coming to aid us, and with the forces of oblivion eagerly tasting Argonian flesh, even as they were banished back in mere seconds, we would still inevitably lose to simple calculus in the end. Tens of thousands of Argonians were dead already, but so were thousands of my own, and while I was fortunate enough to place those who mattered to me in places they would not die on accident, the rest of my army were not so blessed. I supposed the time had finally come. my subordinates and vassals would be able to hold without my direct intervention. The center had Nerevar, Serrano, and Almaril to lead them. The right had Davos, Anondor, and the two brothers, and the left had Alandro and now Akulakan. Dem Navani, the tired Telvanni perked up, his eyes bloodshot from directing so many automatons. Call for a dozen masters to take over Overwatch. I am going for a walk. Chapter 456. Chapter 74, Battle at Thorn Pass, A Storm of Death. General POV. Valazar stewed within his own mind as he just stood atop a small rise, watching his kin throw themselves at the greyskins like maddened beasts. Only the most mentally strong managed to hold themselves back from simply throwing themselves forward, but the insistence of the Hist grew with each Argonian slain. A small part of his mind wept at the needless death, but the tormented creature forbidden from rest he had become only saw the inevitable end that would come once he had done his duty. He almost relished at the idea of finally closing his eyes. But he would have to earn it first, and as rivers of blood flowed, were transformed into death itself, and took lives by the thousands, he was given the permission to move. The Hist speaker to his left startled as he took a step forward, the old woman looking as worn as he felt, and was left behind in a blur as he began running. His kin, maddened as they were, stepped aside as he rushed past them, the sheer instinctual fear of him overpowering their maddened rage for a brief instant and thus saving their lives. He was halfway to the front line when his rush ground to a halt, and he felt the Hist roar in fury. For the second time in this righteous reconquest, Almaril Ferren found himself acting as the supporting pillar of an entire front line. Hundreds of his kinsmen fought, retreated, and were replaced while he remained and kept killing. His blade had been replaced thrice already, the weapons taken from the righteous dead, even as the Hortator's blessings sputtered out and were reignited upon their surface. His muscles tensed, and another 2 Argonians fell before they could strike his winded kin, his battle cries giving them just enough courage to stand up and survive for one moment longer. Long enough to strike once more, long enough to kill just. Another. Lizard. He knew the end was coming. He had been fighting for hours now, and even with his ever-growing strength under Boethia's blessing, the charging enemy was always fresh and rested while he was worn out and tired. His armor was soaked in blood that already stuck to its joints and made movement difficult, and his weapons broke and cracked after striking bone one time too many. He had accepted such a fate and felt it good. But then the air stilled. The enemy warriors stopped their charge as something instinctual overtook their rabid minds, and for a second an odd, unnatural peace descended upon the battlefield. He felt the air to his left stir and saw a familiar figure stroll by him in that same relaxed posture he had grown used to seeing. All of that disappeared once the figure stepped past the Dunmer lines. The Hortator's glowing eyes bore into the beasts standing against him, and then he spoke, "Fus ro da," and the skies were once more covered in blood. The center of the Argonian army disappeared as a clear expanding line was simply turned into a pile of blood and flesh and bone, the fear-filled minds of the lizard men causing them all to contemplate fleeing before the Hist reasserted its authority, and they began throwing themselves back at the enemy with an increased ferocity. But sadly for them, their enemy was done playing. The strike of unrelenting force was swiftly followed by another shout, and with a loud otherworldly hiss of Dovazul, a massive gout of flame lashed out at them, turning the lucky ones to ash in an instant and burning the unlucky to death. Unsatisfied with just this, Raven rose his hand and summoned forth his burgeoning divinity. Connecting to the ash and grasping upwards as a cloud of the cursed winds of Vardenfell made itself known once more. The Argonians faltered, suddenly feeling their energy sputtering and their natural regeneration dying out. With each step he took, the cloud grew in size, and the weapons of the Argonians rose from the ground, joining with the curse and creating a blade storm within the ash storm, killing hundreds each second. The sight of their enemy being turned to whimpering prey emboldened the Dunmer, and soon a countercharge was called, following behind the storm of death that the Hortator had become. But Raven paid no heed to the foolish choices of his subjects. His mind was focused on ending this war once and for all. Raven's point of view. Creating a self-replicating war magic was an idea I played around with ever since the Stormcloak Rebellion began. But I always left the idea alone in the end. The dangers of something so difficult to control were rather self-evident, and I did not need that particular lesson in hubris in this life. That all changed when I ascended and attained perfect control over fire and ash. The curse of Vardenfell bit at the Argonians, ripping their strength and vitality out of them, only to fuel itself further and latch onto the next target. For each Argonian struck, another 3 of them were caught in its range, and so it would continue until it went from being merely self-replicating to becoming truly self-sustaining. If I were not able to control it, that is. Instead of unleashing something I would later regret, I felt each twitch of the magicka and divinity woven into the spell as it killed and transformed and evolved, always pushing it forward but never letting it out of my grasp. And as it evolved, so did my understanding. The hist was not magical in nature, it was purely biological in how it interacted with its creations, and its mental capabilities could in theory be understood with enough science involved. Which is why each time the winds of Vardenfell ripped out a piece of an Argonian, it also ripped out the slightest trace of the hist's near-infinite influence into the growing maelstrom, and right into my grasp. The tree fuckers obviously noticed this, and I felt their connection flare in power instead of retreating. All of the influenced Argonians, and many of those who were previously resisting, suddenly rushing at me in an attempt to drown me in bodies. All they ended up doing was drowning in their own blood. My storm of blades, which at first merely cut into their bodies, was now set alight with my aedric magicka, searing their flesh and stopping them in their tracks, even as hemomancy ignited their blood and turned their brave charge into a chain of fiery explosions. None of them even managed to approach me as I destroyed unit after unit, not pausing once in my stride as I fought to ensure the people I now called my own would never be threatened by them ever again. How ridiculous, I muttered to myself even as I incinerated another group of salamander riders who thought they could end me. The lantern on my hip I did not bother removing, shook slightly as Dagoth spoke. "It is in your blood, descendant. Simply accept it." Ignoring the downright gleeful little fucker strapped to my belt, I stopped strolling and began levitating. Having reached the first front line, where even now a pile of bones acted as an impromptu wall that blocked my passage. The Argonians beyond were already drained of their ability to fight, but I did not let that bother me, and firestorms spread out in all directions before me, killing them indiscriminately and without mercy. I would have contented myself with simply standing there and just letting them kill themselves on my by now nearly unstoppable storm of death. But suddenly I felt numerous warnings from my foresight, and without even bothering to twitch, I rose my hand and turned all the bones under me into spikes of steel. Nearly 100 previously invisible assassins, empowered by the hist and protected from magic with nearly respectable artifacts, found themselves impaled, gurgling in pain, even as they continued futilely trying to drag themselves towards me. Another wave of my hand removed their heads, an overcharged blade of wind more than sufficient to pass through what remained of their protections and ensure none of them would gain a cheeky second wind and try and backstab me at an opportune moment. The enemy horde was emboldened by my distraction and surged at me once more, and I felt it time to well and truly end this, especially since I saw the final gambit of the hist approaching at breakneck speed. General POV. The great war chief of the Anzilil felt the stares of his strike force on his back. His withdrawal was a decision he hated, but it was also one he knew must be taken for a chance at victory. He turned to the gathered chieftains, shamans, and champions, all of whom stared at him with looks of grim acceptance. He was tempted to say something, to justify his actions and the deaths that followed, but he knew there was no use in such weak platitudes now, so all he did was raise his hammer and grip his axe and step forward, trusting his actions to inspire what his words would not. In the distance, the hateful wind reaped through his kin and spewed tongues of flame that seemed to feed on their deaths. What was once an attempt to drown the enemy in bodies had been turned around on its head, and he knew that not a one had managed to reach their target in time to do anything. And so he tugged at his connection to his patrons. and felt a tinge of vindictive glee as his proposal was accepted. The surging assault battering at the winds of death parted, and his army moved to the flanks, charging around their initial target and now aiming to kill as many of the greyskins as they could before the curse took them, leaving his path forward open and without obstacle. Once more he found himself sprinting forward, even as his kinsfolk did their best to follow. He rushed into the cursed wind and felt it scratching at his protections like a ravenous beast that was barely contained outside the multitude of shields placed upon him. The enemy warchief came into sight, and Valazar felt his heart beat with fury as his sprinting charge turned into a blur. He did not hesitate as he neared his target, throwing himself forward and swinging at his target with all his might. Only to be dodged with such offensive ease, he might as well have been swinging at air. A disturbingly familiar feeling indeed. In the next instant, Valazar felt his hand disappear up to the shoulder as he twisted away from a deceptively light, decapitating swing of the one-bladed sword, which then took his leg as it extended into a glaive. His limbs returned in a blink, but his armor remained where it was, useless as it had proven itself to be. Valazar growled and threw himself back in the fight, once more feeling his attacks be deflected or dodged so easily he felt as if he was being played with. His fury and shame, once he realized his foe was still casting spells across the entire battlefield, all the while practically ignoring him, was such it gave him a heart attack for a split second. The moment the rest of his attack force joined him, however, he knew it was all over, because the elf stopped playing around and gave them his full attention. The shamans readied their spells, and the warriors rushed forth to do glorious battle. It all ended in less than a minute. The shaman's shields, strongest amongst his kin, save for the hissed speaker still protecting the camp, lasted for all of 5 seconds before shattering utterly, the casters meant to protect the warriors and give them a chance to strike being boiled alive for their trouble as their very magic was taken over. Valazar himself was just as useless as they, as no matter how powerful he was, he simply could not catch the enemy with his weapons. His brothers died around him, and all he could do was try and strike at smoke. There was even one moment where he felt like he had struck the enemy, but the blow felt as if he was striking loose sand, and the lack of reaction from the supposedly squishy elf killed that hope in the cradle. But it was all utterly useless in the end, and Valazar felt despair as ash clotted his wounds and his limbs refused to regrow, the influence of the hissed flailing uselessly from within his body as he struggled to even look up. Finally, the elf's gaze met his own, and he felt his skin crawl as he was given the barest glimpse into what he had attempted to kill. That thing was most certainly not an elf. The thing tilted its head for a moment before seemingly recognizing him and chuckling to itself. Well, it muttered, he is certainly going to be pissed. Shaking its head, it let out a distinctly tired sigh before speaking. Sorry about this, kid, but a statement needs to be made. It looked away and shouted, Crane ar Vokun. The shadows under the creature shifted, and suddenly a massive beast appeared, one Valazar quickly recognized as a dragon, if the rumors were true. The warchief felt all his will leave him. He had a fucking dragon this entire time. Thuri. The great beast bowed its head. Crine. The creature smiled under its crowned helm. Thank you for coming. Go ahead and kill the Argonians until they surrender. It would be a pleasure, the beast growled and flung itself into the skies, the noise of the battlefield swiftly joined by the dragon's dread shouts. Valazar knew this meant the deaths of his kin. They will not surrender. He growled at the thing. Is that so? The creature asked with amusement, clear in its voice. Valazar clutched at the last dregs of his defiance. It is so. He hissed. It chuckled and rose an empty hand, opening an upward palm. We will see about that. In an instant, Valazar's instincts screamed at him to flee, but all he could do was watch as the mist and storm around him was suddenly sucked into the open hand of the elf, coalescing into a deceptively simple-looking marble of grey ash. The elf shook its head and crushed it. Valazar's world became agony. Raven's point of view. The curse in my hand burst through the connection to the hist I still held in my grasp, traveling across half a continent in an instant and detonating catastrophically in the distant horizon. My sight could not quite tell me what happened, but I could feel the hist screaming in pain as part of their number began to die outright. The weaker trees no doubt suffering a sudden onset of ash storms as all moisture was sucked from the air to feed their new tormentor. Scorch materialized on my shoulder and enlarged, grabbing onto the half-corpse of the Argonian leader and flying away, and I transformed the bone and metal under me into a comfy throne. The battle was over, and all that was left was the cleanup. General POV. Hist speaker Zelnara quivered as the massive dragon, flanked by an honor guard of Dunmer, strolled into the camp of what remained of the great army of Black Marsh. But the fear did not come from the beast that rent the cliffside asunder with a mere 3 words. No, her terror was focused fully upon the rider that even now had the hist screaming into her ear, practically begging her to seek a removal of the curse slowly overtaking their youngest. The elf gave her one look and simply blinked into existence below his mount, looming over her with a casual ease permitted by his unusual height. So, the Hortator of Morrowind spoke with steel in his voice. How about that surrender? Chapter 4, 157, Chapter 75, Peace Talks. General POV. The field between the armies of the Dunmer and the Argonians was silent as the grave, save for the distant groans of the wounded and dying, and the even farther cheers of the elves, which remained stricken with the joy of victory even hours after it was attained. A small group of lizardmen stood at attention behind their hist speaker, channeling all the pride and courage they yet possessed, but failing miserably to look anything else but defeated. Their erstwhile foes, however, shared none of their discomfort, as the 100 or so elves making up the Hortator's entourage could barely retain their discipline as the jubilation of victory threatened to spill over and make them join their comrades back at the camp. Only the 2 figures standing by the Hortator's own sides were utterly calm, one clad in gleaming golden white plate, and the other an imposing giant of ebony, his purple eyes staring into the souls of the defeated and silently roaring at them to attempt anything. Davos found all of it to be incredibly surreal. Even after experiencing one ridiculous situation after another, he still ended up baffled by the sheer casualness his boss dealt with things that would break the minds of lesser mer. The kid was just standing there, completely still and silent, staring into the lizard woman's eyes, all the while she shivered like a particularly terrified cat that was also wet at the same time. Chuckling at the mental image, the Hortator's oldest servant elbowed the elf next to him and in a hushed tone asked, "What do you think they are doing?" Savos Aran twitched in surprise and gave Davos a scathing look before he too was overtaken with curiosity and began pondering the question while scratching his beard, communicating directly with the hist most likely. He answered after a bit, "The trees do not talk normally, but through the mind, that he can even comprehend any of it is quite impressive. Bloody ridiculous." Davos could not help but chuckle. Quite. The elder archmage shared his amusement. No matter how many times I think I've finally gotten used to it, he always manages to accomplish something even more ridiculous to overturn my worldview. Directing the mage with a doubt-filled side-eye, Davos couldn't help but mutter, "How the hell am I supposed to follow anything then?" Savos smirked at this. I believe Raven has come up with a particularly fitting answer for questions like this." Cursing himself for falling for the bait so easily, Davos still found himself asking, and what would he say? Skill issue. The younger elf closed his eyes and sighed in defeat. Raven's point of view. Talking to a pile of sentient plant life that was currently on fire was something else. A series of incoherent images laced with intent, layered upon intent, blasting into my head with enough force to rattle me if unprepared, that I then had to sift through with enough speed so as to make this conversation actually matter. The most recent retort they hit me with, for example, was something between the evolutionary history of their hist hubs and their importance to their growth, an obvious attempt to bargain for the survival of those same outposts. They still thought we could bargain at this point. Before I could offer my true and full retort, they once more blasted me with mental imagery, showing the massive dust storms currently surrounding their least powerful offspring and sucking out their life force, urging me to hurry up and accept their terms so as many as possible would survive. It was then that I realized something. When people described the hist as alien, They could never truly translate just how far their alien nature went. There was no emotion to be found on the other side, only impulsive reaction to do with survival and propagation. There was no morality or even the most basic concepts of it, but the basic directive to go forth and multiply. Even their perception of their most powerful servants, the Argonians, was something akin to a human looking at benign bacteria, but in this case the bacteria was far more efficient and controllable. I was also graced with the side benefit of catching a glimpse of how they perceived myself, and barely held back a grin as I realized that to them, I was but just another ravenous devourer seeking to take their place in the battle for survival. This enlightened me to two things. One, the reason why they reacted to my ascension so very violently, an instinctual need to remove a threat before it grows and begins encroaching on the resources the Hist needed for further growth. And two, they put me in the same category as the Aedra and Daedra, which meant they now overestimated my power to a ridiculous extent. Who was I to deny such a magnificent bargaining chip? With a slight bit too much glee in my soul, I focused my vast mind and formed a rapid series of complex thoughts and images, all of them laced with vicious and deadly intent. I showed them the effects of my curse, both present and distant. I showed them the image of the dead and soon-to-be-dead Argonians. The image shifted, and I blasted them with the image of what I could scry of Black Marsh, and the inevitable effect that amount of fuel would have on the Hist themselves. They began to rumble and attempted to respond, but I was not done. A map of Tamriel formed, and I outlined the exact borders I wanted, carving my intent into the lines so that the Hist knew not to try and cross them for a period of 30 years, discounting those Argonians not under their influence. Following this came the image of complete and utter isolation from both the Daedra and the Aldmeri Dominion for the same duration. Finally, and just to make my point absolutely clear, I overcharged my third eye and beheld the vague outline of the Black Marsh in its entirety, and overlaid it with a version of it covered utterly in ash, where numerous trees were turned into grey husks as winds bit into them for an eternity. And in the center of it all stood a sole elf bearing my face and my disdainful expression. This was not a negotiation. This was an ultimatum. The Hist turned utterly silent for a long moment before their response came, and oddly enough it was not the previous jarble of images and intent, but a single coherent thought. Acquiescence. The connection remained still, their acceptance tied to me, immediately dispelling the curse that even now ravaged their most vulnerable selves. My eyes narrowed, the first physical movement I made since the start of these negotiations, as I sent back a clear message back. Treachery is death. They understood my meaning immediately, and with what felt like the easiest flick of the hand, but was in truth a massive movement of conceptual power, I felt the distant curse sputter out in an instant. And just like that, the connection closed off, and the war for Deshan was over. The Hist speaker shaman whose name I've learned was Zelnara stumbled back, clutching at her staff as blood flowed freely from her snout. She looked up to me with bloodshot eyes, waving her guards off with a harsh jerk of the hand. "Has an agreement been reached?" she asked. "It has." I allowed my previous aura of terror to disappear. "Your masters have accepted a return to previous borders as well as isolation for the period of 30 years, and not a day less. Trade shall still be permissible, but you are forbidden from making bargains with either Daedra or the Dominion." Quickly I added, "This also includes the Cyrodiil border." Her back straightened as she glared at me. "There is no way." I raised a finger to my lips. "Shh," causing her and all the lizards behind her to flinch away. Once more letting my magicka settle, I smiled. "You may inquire with your creators, but know this." My voice was utterly calm as I spoke. "Should I perceive any form of betrayal of the aforementioned peace treaty, I will once more descend upon your people, and I will not stop until your lands are as ashen as Vardenfell was before my coming." She was once more trembling, rooted to the ground as the trees that spawned her kind. With a lazy flick of magicka, I appeared next to her and patted her shoulder. "There will be no negotiation. There will be no reasoning, only death." I leaned in and hissed, "After all, your people are all the fuel I will ever need." She was now still as a statue. Clapping my hands with false joviality, I stepped away. "So as I was saying, do we have an understanding?" Zelnara makes an admirable effort at looking dignified as he speaks. We accept your terms. Excellent. I grinned and called, Veyrin, get over here. The young Azuran priest trotted over and offered me a deep bow. What is your will, Hortator? Settle the documentation, if you please. He nods rapidly and summons a small but practical folding table before summoning parchment and bringing out his enchanted quill. He cleared his throat and spoke. The terms of peace between the Kingdom of Morrowind and the Kingdom of Argonia are thus. He goes on to list all of my previously proposed terms, only slightly shifted, as Zelnara and myself agreed on pertinent details when it came to trade and passage for critical services, mostly to do with docking rights and the inevitable refugee exodus of the Deshani Argonians. An important note stipulated that Zelnara would be obligated to get written agreement of the many tribal leaders of note by word or by force to properly ratify it all, something she attempted negotiating against due to practicality, but I shot down immediately as she had all the religious authority to do so. After another round of renegotiation and confirmation, Veyrin drank from a water skin before once more clearing his throat, representing the Kingdom of Morrowind in his capacity as sovereign, Hortator Raven of Great House Dagoth. He looked to me, do you agree to these terms? I do agree to these terms. I went along the pomp with by now practiced ease. The priest nodded and looked to Zelnara, representing the Kingdom of Argonia in her capacity as High Priest, Great Shaman Hist Speaker Zelnara. He pauses once more, do you agree with these terms? She hesitates only for a moment before slowly nodding, I do agree with these terms. Veyrin bowed his head to the both of us, though the one he directed to Zelnara may as well have been a bob. He then spoke in an official tone, let it be known thus, that on the 11th day of sun's dawn of the year 201 of the 4th era by the imperial calendar, the realms of Morrowind and Black Marsh are no longer in a state of war. May this peace last, and prosperity follow. My entourage saluted with their weapons, and the Argonians all visibly deflated, a pair of them in the back, even dropping on the ground and breathing heavily. I stared at them for an uncomfortably long time before saying, you may gather your dead if you so wish, but all their equipment is to be considered war spoils. Zelnara offered me her bitter thanks, and with that the negotiations were finally well and truly over. My arrival back at the camp was greeted with nearly 20,000 elves standing at attention. Every single combatant who could still stand and was not critically busy was present and as clean as they could get over one evening of cleaning up a battlefield. Hell, I even noticed an impressed-looking Divaith Fear standing in the distant background, the old coot giving me a respectful nod the moment he felt my gaze. But I had no time to magically banter with him, and so my focus returned to the army. Their eyes were filled with awe and zeal as they beheld both myself and the massive dragon trudging along behind me, and to my surprise there were only the rarest instances of fear as the ground shook below us. I walked through the impromptu parade ground, offering nods, glancing at every elf I knew to be worthy of recognition as I passed them by. A pattern rapidly recognized as excitement once more grew within the ranks. My mouth remained shut, though, the atmosphere patiently manipulated so that when I did speak, my words would have the greatest impact. I stepped up the raise that only yesterday was a wall of bodies and turned around. My gaze once more passed the army, and an instant later, blasphemy was within my hand and risen above me, soldiers of Morrowind, bravest warriors and martyrs. My voice boomed across the valley, victory is ours. The blade now lowered was promptly embedded below me as I leaned both hands on the pommel and awaited patiently for my declaration to settle. Varan Serrano was the first to respond as he unsheathed his own sword in a salute. Hail Hortator, hail Histbreaker. In an instant the silence was broken, and I was nearly deafened by the massive cheers, the loyalty of Morrowind thus eternally secured, and another moniker added to my collection. It was, I would later admit, a fine addition indeed. Chapter 4, 158, Chapter 76, Days of Triumph. General POV. Mavros's mind blanked as he finally climbed up the crate next to his smiling mother and was given a perfect view of Mournhold's central boulevard. The young Dunmer had never seen so many people gathered in one place that were not Argonian warriors on the march, and even that was when he snuck out with his friends to look at the army of the enemy. But today's gathering was not marred with childish stupidity, and he could do nothing to stop his grin from forming as he looked over the many different styles of clothing from elves as far from Mournhold as Black Marsh. And the noise. Oh, by the Daedra, he could barely hear himself think. He had never expected to see something like this in the bleak city he had lived in for his whole life. The city which, as he suddenly realized, would never be the same. Even before 3 days back when the news arrived, Mournhold had begun its transformation as thousands of troops entered and left the city every day, followed by workers and craftsmen who began mass repairs and renovations. All the while traders started appearing by the dozen, competing with each other to get a first dibs in the city. Mavros was really proud once he shared those thoughts with his mother, something she praised him for hours. She seemed to praise him for the smallest of things these days, probably because. Eyes twitching, Mavros tried focusing on the fact he had seen a proper elven ship a week ago, but his thoughts were already moving to dark places. Not all was perfect in Mournhold. The constant coming and going of soldiers, merchants, and settlers brought about a new kind of chaos as everyone scrambled for the smallest bits of property, causing only loud bidding wars and threats to occur and inevitably ending up in violence, which then brought them down on everyone's heads. The Dres were as most other great houses, save for Dagoth and Sadras to a lesser degree, well known to the populace. The once slaver house were known to be thrifty businessmen and wise logisticians, but the trait that truly came into focus while they patrolled Mournhold in their thousands was that of harsh disciplinarians. Crime rates fell to a crawl in all forms that were not too petty to notice as everyone, and Mavros meant everyone, that was not a complete swit, wanted to escape the gaze of the Dres. Those who did not quickly found themselves beaten, flogged, and ultimately hanged, depending on the crime. On the one hand, the city was in relative peace. On the other, everyone was terrified. The news of glorious victory and peace only served to alleviate some of it as the guards increased their rotations in response, but at least the people had hope to keep them going. Unlike the Argonians, who even now hid in their designated district, most of them refusing to leave their temporary homes, and those that did looking sluggish and terrified. Mavros was confused at this, but one of his more shady friends told him how 4 days ago a bunch of them died to heart attacks or something. A loud blaring of a twisted wailing horn nearly startled the young Mer into jumping off his crate. But his mother's constant grip stopped it. She directed him with a frown and looked just about to start a lecture, but their attention was drawn by the gates opening as thousands of pristinely armored elves began marching in. Thousands upon thousands of boots marched in perfect unison as drums beat and heralds rode by every unit, and in what must have been magically enhanced voices proclaimed the name and deeds of the force they accompanied, no doubt going ignored by most, but painting a magnificent image in Mavros's mind. So many people had stood together to bring freedom to him and his. He knew the thought naive, at least to an extent, but he could not help his smile nonetheless. Unit after unit marched past them, their deeds greater than those who came before them, even as those who came first had earned glory beyond most warriors. The gathered people were awed utterly, and the time came for the final group to march. But as the final band approached, there were no grand proclamations or heralds exalting their glories, only absolute silence as the Hortator rode his massive steed with his head held high. Every single part of him looked immaculate, from the robes that looked to be made of shadow to the armor upon which runes glowed with power most would never know. Each and every piece of gear looked to be the creation of something beyond a mere mortal, and the person himself somehow managed to top it all with merely his gaze. No words were needed for the one who had nearly burned Black Marsh for his people after all. Raven's point of view. What ridiculous posturing, Dagoth drawled into my mind. You should just proclaim yourself their god, and they will all fall over themselves to worship you. I couldn't help but grin, cope. Your insolence knows no bounds, descendant. Leave this foolish path you have undertaken. My grin widens. Seethe. You would truly give it all up. Now that all I ever desired is within your grasp, you would throw it all away for such petty things as morality. Had I been made of flesh, my cheeks would be hurting now, mauled. Finally he breaks "fuck you" and shuts up. Huh. General POV. The celebrations in Mournhold lasted for nearly a full day as the soldiers finally began to unwind after the long march, the citizens and reservists all but throwing themselves at them to buy anything from a story to recognition, all the way up to snagging an up-and-comer for themselves by some of the more bright-minded ladies. Though not all were permitted to simply disband for the day, as those few who had stood out during the many battles were called to the inner city, even as a good number of them doubted they would be given any kind of true recognition. There were far too many of them called for that after all. And oh, how wrong they were proven, as nearly 2,000 elves were called before the Hortator and his now reassembled council, and their sovereign personally told everyone of their deeds, before allotting them with both wealth and land. Earl of Kraganmore barely contained the shaking of his legs as he listened to the many champions of the army be called forth and praised, some of them being directly congratulated for cutting down over 10 enemies in a single bout, or taking grievous injury and still standing. All heroes beyond Earl, of course. He could barely even remember the battle after it was done, which probably just meant he was a coward. "El of Kraganmore," the herald called, and he nearly leaped from his boots before quickly settling himself and marching out with the closest excuse he had for steadiness. Only once he stopped moving did he raise his head, and nearly felt the urge to flee once it finally set in where he was standing. In what was once the palace of Almalexia, in front of a grand fresco depicting the entire journey of the Hortator, up to and including the burning of the Hist, stood a throne. It was a magnificent seat indeed, carved from the finest wood that looked suspiciously like magically dried Hist, and lined with silver and amethyst. That singular chair was probably worth more than some towns. All of it paled in his mind when compared to the person seated upon it. The mere idea of comparing the deceptively young elf before him to anything felt like a crime to Irel's shaking mind. The Hortator was patient as he processed everything, but the 6 great lords near him were not so, and the Archmagister looked just about ready to deliver one of his usual scathing remarks, but was preempted as the sacred sovereign finally spoke. Earl of Kraganmore. The powerful voice banished all doubt from the warrior's mind in less than an instant. "Do you know why you have been called?" Oh shit. His mind began reeling. How did I fuck up? "Speak, boy." The Telvanni finally lost his patience. Errol flinched under the gaze of so many great ones and stood at attention. "I do not, Hortator." "That is odd," the sacred sovereign muttered, and before Errol's mind could spiral even further, he went on. "Because I am quite certain I saw you personally slay exactly 37 Argonians and remain standing until the end of the battle, nearly bleeding out as I took to the field." Errol's eyes widened, but all he could do was stand there, gaping like a fool. The warriors all around him began muttering amongst themselves and giving him freshly appraising looks, none of them even daring to imagine what the Hortator had just said may be a lie. Was this why everyone was giving me odd looks while we marched? He finally realized. "But," the Hortator went on, "I see your mind still rejects this." There was a tense silence that followed, but the one who spoke did not look offended in the least. "So allow me to show you." A finger was pointed at him, and Iril saw images of himself doing things he did not even imagine himself capable of, and looking downright heroic as he used Grey's saber to cut through the enemy with fire and steel, inspiring his comrades to do much the same. He blinked and flinched as the knowledge settled, his heart attempting to explode through his ears. "Sarano," the Hortator spoke, drawing the attention of the Redaran Archmaster. "He is one of yours, correct?" "A retainer, yes." The scarred warrior nodded, not for long after that showing, of course. "I will leave the rightful promotions in your capable hands, then." The Hortator accepted easily, "But I too have rewards of my own to give." He faced Irel again. "For your deeds and valor in the Deshan campaign, I award you, Irel of Kraganmore, with 80 acres of fertile farmland to the north of Mournhold, Alongside a large home within the city itself, you are also to be given a flat sum of 30,000 septims and a choice between a pair of either gar or horse. He pointed a hand to a nearby door. You may present yourself before the scribes for the exact details of it all. The once cobbler stood there stunned before rapidly bowing his head and muttering a string of thanks as the realization his life had just been irreversibly changed began to set in. He was utterly dazed as he stepped away, somehow managing to ignore the curious looks of his comrades as he retreated into a nearby corner and just stared into the wall. He came back together an entire 3 hours later, and the award ceremony was still going on. Davos whistled as he strolled through the many winding streets of the new capital, the people barely noticing his passage as he pulled on his patron to avoid the bother and prayed that she was not too amusement-starved for the day. He was finally noticed as he approached his destination, and the group of cheap muscle visibly flinched at the sight of him. "Good evening, gentlemen." He smiled at them. "Would you kindly inform the lady of the house that she has important guests?" The guards before him were utterly still before the youngest among them gathered himself and nodded rapidly. Of course, my lord. Please follow me." Davos's smile remained on his face as he was led through the underground base and entered the now familiar gathering place of the excuse of an organization the modern Kamona Tong had become. The rowdy group of entrepreneurs stilled as he entered, and some of them went for their weapons before it clicked just who they were looking at, and all of them without exception paled. Found out who Davos was finally? He scoffed internally. If they failed at that, then he may as well have just culled them for sheer stupidity. The doors leading to their boss's office creaked open, and the woman exited, followed closely by her second, Lord Davos, Kingpin Varana, bowed with a fake smile. "How may our little family aid the Hortator's right hand?" His expression remained utterly unchanged as he drawls, channeling his inner boss. "I believe you know exactly why I am here. Do not waste both of our days by procrastinating." The Kingpin flinches minutely, but still keeps her fake expression. "But of course." She directs a look at her second, and they share a quick nod before both looking back to him. "We would be fools to let an opportunity like this fall through our hands, even if it means binding ourselves into service." Davos says nothing. The woman does an admirable job at hiding her frustration as her smile turns only slightly brittle and she silently inhales. "How may the Kamona Tong serve the honored Hortator's interests today?" "Much better." Davos claps his hands the moment she finishes speaking. "How about we take a seat first?" His expression shifts into an irritatingly smug one as he adds, "This might take a while." Raven's point of view. The city below me remains awake even as midnight nears, but the noise fails to reach me, and after months of trudging through swamp, I finally get to enjoy a cup of coffee without any true pressure, or at least immediate pressure. Which is, of course, the exact moment I feel a familiar presence materialize in the chair opposite me, and fail contain a long, tired sigh. "Not one day of peace. Arr!" Retainer in the context of the Redarin means follower of a noble, basically the lowest level of a house member. Retainer in the context of the Dagoth means a noble follower, effectively a member of Raven's household that is recognized as a noble under his service. Sorry for the confusion, I still haven't gotten around to reorganizing the rankings for the 6th house. Chapter 4, 159. Chapter 77, Many Visitations and Most Moral Experimentations. My reaction, naturally, only serves to amuse my visitor as she lounges in her seat. "Good evening, dear." The smirking face of Mephala greets me as I turn to face her. "Sup," I give her a lazy wave. "Why, thank you." She smiles and teleports my coffee into her hand, which I allow, and takes a sip. I roll my eyes, very clever. "What is that catchphrase of yours?" She hums, "I am the image of wit." Feeling the amusement slowly overtake my annoyance, I smirk and bow my head with a dramatic flourish of my hand. "Your sharp mind is indeed a gift to us all, my lady." She titters and fans at her face. "Oh my, how charming." I can't help but snort, much to her evident pleasure if her smile was anything to go by. But I also make sure to remain silent and just lean back. enjoying the ensuing silence as she waits for me to ask the usual question. Her amusement grows with my apparent defiance, but after a while she realizes I am more than content to just sit here for hours. She huffs out a laugh. "Changing tactics, dear." Waving her question away lazily, I say, "Just taking as much time to relax as I can get before you decide to afflict me with paranoia for a laugh." She lets out an immediate faux gasp at this. "Why, Raven, can't a lady visit her favorite little Aelnofe?" "Realize that, did you?" I quirk an eyebrow. She just smirks. "Dear, I have been there when they first descended onto the world. Of course I recognized what you became, and so did my two dearest colleagues." Fair, I accept her point. But that is enough of that. Her posture suddenly shifts as she turns serious. "First, allow me to congratulate you on crushing those annoying little trees so utterly. Watching that was a delight." The way she says the final word nearly makes me shiver, but I manage to hold it back. "Not a fan of them, I see." I ask. "Why not remove them then?" "Because they make things more interesting." She shrugs. "They are odd, different, alien from us. Simply cutting them out would make the world that much duller." I see. For a moment I am tempted to frown at this, but I am not foolish enough to expect mortal morality from her, and immortality is a really long-ass time. That is fair enough, I suppose. And I am very happy to hear that. She smiles. "Sometimes even I nearly get lost in all the mortal hang-ups you all seem to have developed over the eras." I immediately roll my eyes. "No, you don't." She just smirks. Shaking my head, I decide to move the conversation on. "Any news on the dreaded Daedric grapevine?" "Nothing too interesting, I am afraid," she answers with pretend sadness. "Things have been mostly peaceful so far. Sheogorath has been acting rather odd, but that is par for the course, even if he is being somewhat creative this time." "Finally leaving the cheese jape behind?" I ask. She chuckles. "Not even I like watching him, so who knows?" I hum. "Anything else?" She taps the table for a few moments before snapping her fingers and pointing at me. "Ah, yes. Azura and Boethia also sent their utmost regards. You can consider their support assured for the following few centuries or so." "That is certainly useful." I smile in thanks. "All right then, so what is it?" "Oh," she tilts her head almost cutely. "I am not quite certain what you are insinuating there, dear." "Mephala," I deadpan. "You always visit like this to drop something on my lap. What is it?" She pretends to sigh tiredly. "Feeny." She huffs and straightens back up. "Azura predicted that you need to deal with what is happening on that little island in your new domain within 3 months, or things will escalate. Considerably." "That is," I pause, "actually pretty doable, thanks." Her smile then could have melted the sun. We make some more small talk for a while, before inevitably she is distracted by something far away and disappears, and I return to my relaxation, oddly at peace, even with the new bit of danger in the future. Well, not truly new, but having a set time did certainly put things into perspective. An hour of silent contemplation and relaxation, later the familiar buzz of my orb drew my attention, and as I read the incoming message, I couldn't help but raise my eyebrows. It would seem I had another guest to entertain. General POV. His first thoughts as his mind awakened were dry. His body felt as if it were covered in tar, and instinctively he attempted flicking his tongue out to moisturize his mouth, but the moment he so much as twitched, a wave of weakness assailed him and nearly sent him straight back into unconsciousness. As if someone manually turned them on, his ears began working, and a trio of voices reached him. Two familiar Dunmary tones drenched with familiar noble flow, and one unfamiliar yet oddly squeaky and childish Argonian hiss. That final detail was all it took to fully awaken him, and with a failed roar that was more of a silent whine, he sat up. An act he regretted immensely as pain assaulted his every nerve. "Hold there, fool!" The squeaky Argonian appeared above him and slapped him before he could even see him, somehow not causing any further pain, but still making him lay back down while easing his body's reaction considerably. "Everything fine, master." The familiar voice of the enemy ruler came from nearby, making his mind reel at the term of address. "Worry not, student mine." The egg brother squeaked back. "The fool merely needs a moment to get used to existing without the shit trees." The jovial tone suddenly shifted into one of utter hatred before seemingly righting itself at random. He should be fine in a minute or so. If you say so. He could practically hear the frown in the elf's voice. Right then. The third individual, the other elf, cut in. What have found out? I believe I have an idea. The first elf answered. The hist seems to have overridden his biological makeup with their own traits, imposing their near-constant growth for the price of massive energy consumption and a slow mutation of the mind. So they turned him into a person-sized history, the second one asked. If he survived the inevitable rampant mutation. That did not sound good. Then, kind of. Ah, the other one voiced. The squeaky one rejoined them then. You have ideas then, student mine? I tried going down the restoration route, Bat. That is like trying to bar a dam, since I am not truly restoring anything but attempting to stifle life. The so-called Hortator answered. Alteration seems to be the proper route, and I suspect a mix of rituals and self-modification could be the solution, but I am unsure as of right now. He sighed. I could probably make some stopgaps, but with how busy I am, I recommend tossing him at Tolfdir and Phineas. Those two would probably be able to fully stabilize him until you can teach him how to properly take care of himself. A most wise course of action, most glorious of students. The squeaky one squeaked. But first we must see if the fool has the will to go beyond the animal he was turned to. Valazar felt a growl forming in his throat, but a quick jab from the small Argonian had him sitting up in a near instant, his no doubt heavily bloodshot eyes snapping open once more as he now faced his captors, and the ones who would now use him as a lab rat. His mind supplied quickly. The two elves he recognized easily, both champions of the enemy and both immensely dangerous. The enemy, great war chief, shaman, immediately rose a hand. Hold. Before you say anything, I would like to inform you that your side has lost the war utterly, and the hist itself was forced to admit defeat. You are no doubt considered to have died in the battle, and things will remain as such if I have anything to say about it. Why should I believe you? Valezar's words came out in a rough gargle. I will have the treaty delivered to you later. The elf answered with pure boredom in his voice. Valazar looked around the room, and his eyes inevitably reached the nearby window, which was left conspicuously opened. He recognized the view almost immediately, as he had been to Mournhold on numerous occasions, and the reality of the situation slowly began to set in. He looked back to the elf, who merely rose an eyebrow, and spoke to the tiny Argonian next to him. Your turn now, Master Shalazar. Things ground down to a halt as the words reached Valazar, his tormented but enhanced mind swiftly parceling through the information he was given. Small albino Argonian, someone a great shaman would call Master, and the name Shalazar, once granted as a sign of great wisdom, but turned to a curse for the greatest of betrayals amongst his people. Still, defeat had taught Valazar humility, and so instead of trying to pounce at his new target, he merely growled at him, You taught the one who would see our people enslaved once more? The elf scoffed, but did not speak. Oh no, it was the betrayer's voice that struck his mind next. Speak not of what you do not understand, fool. He was visibly holding back from growling back. My student disdains that which you use as an excuse, and you know this well. He immediately went to retort, defending the enim. But the betrayer scoffed, somehow making him shut up with the mere noise. My enemy he was not. He squeaked tersely, Merely because I resemble you does not mean we are of same thought, fool. Valezar felt his words die in his throat because, well, he small Argonian did resemble him, to an uncanny degree, to the point that they may as well have been born from the same egg, even with their differences in size. Then why? He croaked, their previous conversation and his current one not tracking with each other. Why even bother trying to save me? To be fair, I did it mostly as a favor to Master Shalazar here. The elven leader piped in, It is entirely up to him how you end up. Valazar said nothing and faced the tiny one. Once I was foolish like you too. He spoke softly, the comical squeak barely present. So very bloodthirsty, so very willing to sell my mind and body to the fucking plants that see us only as tools to expend. The once war chief felt like protesting but held back. Impotent rage would do him no good here. The little one's eyes brightened as he looked up. I too slaughtered my way through Deshan and all the way up to the Telvanni lands. Why, a good part of the slaughter was my own work. But you already know that, do you not? All Valazar could do was numbly nod. But once I was done cutting through their towers and slaying both the adults and the children in the name of my vengeance, do you know what I felt? He asked rhetorically. Nothing but emptiness. My mind, which was once honed to strike, was now bereft of purpose, and all that remained was emptiness. His easy expression turned utterly blank as he stared directly into Valazar's soul. A broken tool was of no use to them, and so they tried to extract what little use they still could, and had my empty vessel reproduce. Valazar felt rather sick as he realized where this was going. And so, O descendant most foolish, Shalazar grinned, do you still desire to hold on to your blind loyalties as a good little disposable pet? Or do you want to use the chance I am giving you to try and actually live for yourself? Valazar's mind was reeling as his entire world slowly crumbled down around him. But he was not given too much time to think before Shalazar spoke once more. No need to choose now, foolish boy. Think deeply of my wisdom. I will return later for your answer. Raven's point of view. As our trio of Arkmagi were leaving the private wing, still deep in discussion about the state of Valazar, his future, and how to potentially replicate his growth in a safe manner, we were stopped by a sudden defensive bubbling of magicka coming form nearby. All three of us rounded on the intruder, and we came face to face with Demnavani and Fear, the latter of whom was utterly relaxed, while the former was visibly holding back from blasting Shalazar with as many spells as he could muster in a second. Gentlemen, I greet them with a raised eyebrow. Fire just smirks, while Demnavani ever so slowly turns his gaze to me, Dagoth. He remembers to greet, forgive me, my Alinori, but what in the most accursed fuck is the pale scourge doing in the palace? Master Shalazar is my guest, I answer blandly. Do not fear, he is tentatively on our side. On our side, Demnavani whispers to himself, do you have any idea what the little mother... My eye, twitching, stops the curse as he corrects himself, what he did to my house. Hissed fuckery, I fire back easily. He pauses, gives the smirking Shalazar a look, turns back to me and visibly holds back from spitting on the ground. Fine. I do not like it, but I will not make a fuss since you obviously trust him, but do kindly make sure he is not seen by the rest of them. I do not need a revolt right now. I give Shalazar a sideways glance and he nods. He will be careful. Good, Demnavani sighs. I guess that is all I can ask for, really. He turns to leave. I will see you on the council meeting. I need a drink after this and chow. And trots off without another word. Seeing the Mer leave, I look to the other visitor present. Fire, I trust your accommodations are pleasant. They shall suffice, he replies naturally. However, I have not come here for a meet and greet, even if I do admit a certain curiosity towards our resident mass murderer. Shalazar scoffs. Maybe some other time, bored one. Fur just smirks at this and looks to me. I believe our schedules finally align enough that we may continue discussing our pact. Quickly scanning through my agenda for the day, I nod. Very well, I do not mind. I quickly turn to Shalazar and Savos. I trust that the two of you will be able to entertain yourselves for a while. Savos rolls his eyes and Shalazar nods happily. But of course, most glorious student of mine. He pauses and adds, Ah, my most mighty mind seems to have slipped a delightfully important message I needed to deliver. Catching on, I ask, and what is this message? She has been patient because she understands the necessity. He states, there is no longer a need for said patience. Savos and Fear look utterly lost, but I understand what he was saying instantly, no doubt aided by Shalazar's own mysticism-based fuckery. So that is what Mafala meant when she mentioned Ole Sheo. Well, shit. She is probably laughing her ass off right now. The wave of spectral amusement I feel through my bond is all the confirmation I need. Chapter 460, Chapter 78, of Diseases Divine and Futures Sublime. Raven's point of view. And that very same capability to utterly suffuse a being and change it on a fundamental level as a side product of a seemingly simple disease is what drew my attention to begin with. Fear finishes his 20-minute rant by reiterating his initial point and finally focuses back on me. As I am sure you know, my admiration for your ancestors' work is no great secret to those worthy of knowing. Right, I drawl out, only having been half listening to him, going into exhausting detail as to why he thought Corpus was the tightest shit in the history of ever, and the constant mental nods of Dagoth of course, and we are just going to brush over the numerous ethical implications of its creation because of it all. I wave my hand at him flippantly. That totally inspires my belief in your responsibility with the knowledge you are asking of me. He scoffs and rolls his eyes. Do kindly skip playing the goody two-shoes card, Dagoth. We both know that most grand discoveries require a certain amount of sacrifice, and neither my hands nor yours are clean in this matter. He grins slightly and leans forward. Or are you telling me your research into the Falmer came with no accidents or reasonable sacrifices whatsoever? I pause, narrow my eyes, and point at him. Point, but counterpoint they were literal beasts before I got to them, while you are talking about changing actual people. He gives me a cocky smirk at that, and yet those very same people who are now under your rule are the product of your own cruelty. Are they not? My eyes narrow as I consider either talking his ear off or just telling him to fuck off before my subconscious reminds me how much effort that would take, and I sigh. Trying to convince a 4,000-year-old geriatric of the error of his ways is not how I would like to spend the next decade, so let us return to the topic at hand. Instead of being offended, Devaith Fire lets out a short chuckle. Indeed, there are far better things we could be discussing than the deaths and eternal enslavement of thousands. I pointedly make my eye not twitch as he goes on, like the exact details of how one can make a spell so very pervasive and difficult to counter in the first place. Fancy god magic, I reply with a cheeky grin to match his earlier one, so cheeky a grin in fact that Fear pauses for an entire second before delivering me a look so dry it may as well remove all hist influence from Deshan in an instant. Oh, really? He asks with utmost sarcasm. Indeed. I smirk, and before he can voice his amazement with my wisdom, I go on, but jests aside, I was not fully joking when I said that. Fear says nothing, but I had by now fully captured his attention, the entirety of the previous conversation merely serving to amuse us both. Something Fear did for the amusement's sake itself, while I used to flee from my job. Sovereignty sounds cool until everyone and their mother starts bothering you at all times about things so inane you'd think they are fucking with you. I really need some simulacrum clones or something, because this is not how I am spending years of my life, much less decades or centuries. Having spent the entirety of 1 nanosecond whining to myself, I refocused on the conversation. In truth, the Corpus's abilities are not as much a question of skill and power, but of authority. Fire narrows his eyes once more. Authority, you say? A specific property of the energies of the heart of Lorcan allowed it then. Technically correct, I nod easily. The truth of the matter is far more complex and involves, well, quite bluntly, it involves yourself and the world recognizing said authority so that you can act upon factors usually locked away from mortal hands, either in scope or in their entirety. He catches on the hidden implication easily enough, but his next question is obviously one far more important to him. And what is this factor when it comes to Corpus? I shrug. The fact it affects souls, and not just on the surface either. Fear is utterly silent for a good 10 seconds before flatly asking, what? You are aware of how black soul gems merely capture full mortal souls and do not actually drain them, I ask. He scoffs. A fool's apprentice worth more than the dirt they step on knows that. It is a trade for short-term power for one side and long-term power for the other. His face practically shouting for me to get on with it. How good, then, that you have proven yourself above such a station, I quip, just to annoy him. But yes, even with the support of the ideal masters, as they like to call themselves, the black soul gems, could not contain a true soul, much less drain it. That task fell to the parasites in Oblivion, who did it over extremely long periods of time. His eyes narrow in concentration. Yes, I can see how something that could surpass the ideal masters would be locked behind certain requirements. He looks back up to me, also like to call themselves. I grin half sheepishly, half eagerly. I may or may not have ended up blowing the soul cairn up when I went to fetch Crine and an Elder Scroll. So that is why the efficiency of my black soul gems has dropped so massively, I hear him mutter. I am sorry, what? I raise an eyebrow. He blinks and focuses back on me. Don't even start. I just snort. As interesting as that little revelation was, he goes on, visibly holding questions back. I doubt you have an entire day to regale me of your adventures. Indeed I do not, I nod. There is less than an hour before the next council meeting. Very well, he grumbles. This authority you mentioned, what is it truly? Because if you plan on telling me I have wasted entire centuries on trying to replicate Corpus just to have it all locked behind some mystical arbitration, I am going to break something. All you will be breaking is your own ego. I scoff and let loose a bit of my aura, immediately shutting him up, though not actually scaring him, interestingly enough. As to actually answer your question, you are both correct and not. You have not been locked out arbitrarily, as you put it. You have merely been missing a certain quality from within your magic itself. That sounds threateningly close to semantics. He drawls but then frowns. Authority, qualities, factors. He looks me dead in the eyes. You speak as if you already can do all these things. Come on then, Fear. You are a clever geriatric. You can figure it out. I falsely cheer him on. He looks like he wants to flip me off, but his curiosity is overwhelming at this point, so much so that he does nothing but mumble for a good minute until utterly stilling a moment later. It does not require magicka at all, does it? I tilt my head before shaking it slightly. Magicka does serve to make things infinitely more efficient, but no. Divinity, I had never taken Dagoth Ur's meaning to be so very literate, he finally states in realization. Oh, I knew he was more than aware of what divinity was, but the mechanics had forever been obscured from him. From him and everyone else, not deemed worthy of perceiving them, of course. Dear Hermaeus did have an actual purpose in the world, as offensive as I found the idea to be. Indeed, I grin, or Adric Magicka if you want to be pedantic about it. He lets out a very long breath as the realization sinks in, before bursting out into amusement-filled laughter loud enough to have Akulakan peek into the room. Fear calms down only after a full minute of chuckles before once staring me in the eyes. You never planned on letting me have it, did you? Come now, Fire, you must actually be more to do more, and you have been slacking for centuries. I smirk and lean my elbows in the table while crossing my hands in front of my face. And before you start pestering me for further information, how do you plan on paying me for telling you something no other mortal mage would be willing to share? He frowns and then grins. I left the room followed by Akulakan, who now carried a large magical box that sealed its contents so thoroughly I'd need a full hour to see what was within, and a couple tomes worth of information on creating artificial life such as clones and the like. Because of course, while Fear failed at playing God in fucking with others' souls, he most certainly did not fail in fucking with their forms. And my current companion was living proof of how the world treated such discrepancies after a certain point. My master, Akulakan rumbled after we walked a good distance, his hands shaking the box they held slightly, as if to see if there was anything wrong with it. What are your plans with this thing? Sentient weapons are a rarity, but not a terribly unique concept in their own right. I say after a moment's thought, no, dear Umbra has given me a rather interesting idea for a project whenever I have the time for it. And what is this project? The surprisingly curious automaton asks, do you plan on giving it to one of your meatbags so they can become less useless? I pretend like I am going to leave the answer a mystery for a good while before ever so slowly looking up to my massive guardian. What do you think of getting a sibling? General POV. An hour or so after the scholarly meeting, the young sovereign of the Dark Elves found himself doing something far less entertaining than magical elaborations, and far more necessary. The great hall of the resplendent palace of Mournhold was oddly silent as its 9 current inhabitants failed to occupy even a percentile fraction of its massive space. their hushed voices barely reaching the closest pillars before dissipating utterly. Indeed, the hall that could house thousands held only 5 great lords and their hortator, his 2 closest helpers in his right hand, and grandfather, and his silent-as-the-grave bodyguard, who seemed to blankly stare into the distance with his 2 glowing purple eyes. Thank you for that report, Alandro. Keep up the good work, and if you need additional forces, do not be afraid to ask. The veterans are already getting jittery, and I might as well have them keeping order instead of ruining it. The hortator spoke in a lazy drawl. The lord of the Indoril, tasked with the unenviable duty of keeping order in Deshan, nodded with confidence. Of course, hortator, I will not allow pride to endanger any of your subjects. The nearby Archmagister scoffed, but impressively managed to hold himself back from a snide comment. And I do believe that concludes today's minutiae. Varan Serrano spoke with assured discipline, even as he gave his liege lord a curious glance. Quite? Baladas Demnevani nodded. We've wasted enough time with things that could have easily been thrown to our subordinates, so can you finally tell us what you called us here for? Oh, do cease your constant whinging, Baladas. Sindral Sadras rolls her eyes. Indeed, Baladas, the hortator drawls, much to the chagrin of the more serious members of his council, you do not have to act your age all the time. The Archmagister's fingers twitch, but he once more demonstrates impressive self-control, as no birds are flipped. But yes, as amusing as fucking with Demnevani here is, the hortator goes on. Ignoring the Archmagister's finally failed control, I do have a reason for calling you all here in such small numbers, namely I have called you all here to discuss the future of Morrowind and that of the Empire. The reactions of those gathered were mixed, though mostly consisting of silent acceptance of their suspicions being confirmed after a long period, and well-contained anger in the case of one Anaris Dreres. She had grown rather discontent with her house's perceived loss of influence, and only the fact that all the other houses were outright loyalists at this point, and that her own had been bought by vast swathes of land being returned to them, stopped her from speaking out immediately. She did still receive a raised eyebrow from her sovereign and knew her thoughts were obvious for all to see. I see all of you are already wise to my way of thinking. The hortator nodded. But let us discuss it anyway. You are all aware of how and why I came to Morrowind in the first place, no? Indeed, Varan Serrano spoke up slowly. You came seeking allies for the Empire and their upcoming conflict with our distant cousins from Somerset, did you not? Correct, Rayan nodded. My plan was never to claim the throne, but to unite this land and save it from evils unleashed by those now centuries dead. Now that I have done so, my plans must continue to restoring the world itself. Except you took one good look at what was going on and decided to upend it all. A voice not of the Lord spoke, and they all turned to a rather amused Savos. You should have expected that to begin with. Part of me did. Raven shrugs as if to say, what can you do? But the fact of the matter remains that even as your sovereign, I still have allegiances within both the White Gold Tower itself and even Skyrim to a lesser extent. And so what? Demnevani frowns. Do we just run back to the Empire even after they repeatedly abandoned us to save themselves for no true gain? He pauses. Well, besides getting the chance to push the haughty Altma's heads in, of course. The hortator snorts. I personally find the idea of showing the Altma just how high they are in truth to be worth a bit of my political power. There is some grumbling around the table, most of it vindictively agreeable. A distinctly female chuckle drew their gazes away from the mage. I, for one, would love closer ties with the Empire. Trade across borders, no matter how unofficial, gets irritating after a while. As much as it grates on my pride, Lady Sadras does speak sense. Archmaster Sarano added, seeking closer ties may prove more advantageous than seeking independence at this time, even if we could reasonably win such a conflict without a blade being raised. Right, Demnevani grumbled, but did not actually voice any disagreement. The room descended into weighing of pros versus cons, as anyone with any kind of reasonable interest calculated the future advantages of their house in either situation. The Redoran were mostly supportive of remaining within the Empire due to it being both the honourable choice as Titus Mead did periodically send aid, and their Hortator was effectively an imperial loyalist, self-interested as he was. The Sadras were fully on board with the idea, being only truly interested in increasing their trade empire and a fresh but rapidly growing industrial domain under the leadership of a certain artillerist leader who had grown very interested in machines over the period of the Dashan campaign. The Dres as a house were very close to the Sadras in their ambitions, so even as their leader hid her frustration, their support was all but assured. The Telvanni, in truth and as always, did not give a shit. And last but most certainly not least, the Indaril. Once asked, their grand descendant simply said, as proven leader in both matters divine and secular, the Hortator's word is final in all things, and refused to elaborate. Raven was personally quite amused by the response, so much so that when he spoke next, it was with a smirk that was not just slightly more assured than before. We are in agreement then? We are to meet with the Empire of Tamriel and fully discuss our place within this union, for good or ill. As much as your influence outstripping any and all opposition can be called agreement. Demnavani scoffed, even as he nodded. All of you with frowns on your faces seem to be forgetting one very important fact in all this. Raven spoke with a small smirk, drawing immediate looks of curiosity. The Emperor is a friend, and I have saved his empire thrice over. The High King of Skyrim might as well be my sworn brother in the traditions of the Nords, and the recently announced Crown Princess is, well, let us just say that we are rather keen on cooperation as two beings of immense power, and leave it at that for now. Savos openly snorted at this, drawing either curious or knowing looks from the rest of those present. The point is, my dear subjects and friends, the sacred sovereign smirked, that once in the past we may have had to depend on the generosity of my friends, asking them to send food and materials to us in exchange for our support. He leaned forward, his grin turning somewhat dark. But now it is us who hold the upper hand in nearly all things. And that is a fact I am more than willing to use to our advantage. He chuckles. Know that while our freedom may be sold, it most certainly will not be coming cheap.